There is a particular kind of man who spends his entire life preparing for a moment that may never come, who studies every battle ever fought, who reads the old commanders by candlelight, who practices the art of war the way other men practice prayer, with devotion, with obsession, with the unshakable belief that somewhere ahead the world is going to need exactly what he has to offer. Most men like that die waiting. History is full of their names, or rather, full of their absence. The generals who trained for a war that ended too soon. The commanders who peaked in peacetime and faded into footnote. George Smith Patton Jr. was not that man. He was the other kind, the kind who waits and waits and waits, who absorbs every humiliation, every demotion, every whispered conversation at headquarters, suggesting he is simply too much, too loud, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted with real responsibility. And then, when the moment finally arrives, he does not merely rise to meet it. He detonates. What follows tonight is the complete story of the 3rd United States Army and its race across France, one of the most breathtaking military campaigns of the 20th century, and one of the most underappreciated. It is a story about speed used as a weapon, about logistics as the invisible skeleton beneath every bold advance, about the enormous gap between a general's vision and the physical reality of moving hundreds of thousands of men through hostile territory, on roads that were never designed for war. It is a story about one man's absolute refusal to accept the pace that everyone around him considered reasonable. But before we reach the thunder of armoured columns rolling through French villages in the summer of 1944, before we follow the desperate turn northward toward Bastogne in the freezing December darkness, before we stand on the western bank of the Rhine and watch the crossing that stunned an entire army group, we need to understand who George Patton actually was. Not the legend, not the slapping incident, not the ivory-handled revolvers, not the famous speech that opens with profanity and ends with something close to poetry. The man underneath all of that. Because the Third Army did not simply appear, fully formed and unstoppable, in the summer of 1944. It was built, painstakingly and deliberately, from the raw material of a nation that had been at peace for a generation and was now trying to field the most mobile army on earth in the shortest possible time. That is the story we are going to tell tonight. All of it, from the beginning. If you are settling in for a long night, and we hope you are, this is exactly the kind of story that rewards patience. It does not resolve quickly. It breathes and builds and shifts in tone as the campaign itself shifted, from the exhilarating sprint across France to the grinding misery of the Moselle in autumn rain, from the shock of the German offensive in the Ardennes to the final, almost surreal drive into a Germany that was dissolving as the army advanced. There are moments of genuine genius in this story. There are also moments of catastrophic waste, of decisions made in frustration rather than wisdom, of opportunities lost because the wrong man said no at the wrong moment. We will not smooth those edges over. History does not deserve that, and neither do you. The Third Army's campaign across France and into Germany covered roughly 11 months of continuous operations. In that time, Patton's forces liberated more territory, advanced farther, and processed more prisoners than any other American army in the European theater. Those are not contested statistics. They are the arithmetic of what happened. What remains contested, what historians have argued over for nearly 8 decades, is what that achievement cost, what it meant, and whether the man at the center of it was a visionary commander or an extraordinarily lucky one whose aggressiveness happened to align with circumstances. We will let you form your own conclusion, but we will give you everything you need to do so. Settle in now. Make yourself comfortable. The story we are about to tell you spans from the English countryside in 1943 all the way to Bavaria in May of 1945, through the fog of the Normandy bocage, across the Loire River, past the ancient stones of the Meuse Valley, through the frozen forests of Luxembourg, and finally into the heartland of a broken empire. It is, at its core, a story about what human beings are capable of when they are organized, motivated, and led by someone who genuinely believes that the only unforgivable sin in war is standing still. We have been building this documentary for months, poring over operational records, campaign histories, divisional after-action reports, and the personal accounts of the men who drove the trucks, laid the pontoon bridges, maintained the Sherman tanks, and kept Patton's army breathing when everything around it wanted to make it stop. If you want to see more long-form history like this, stories that treat you like an adult, that go deep rather than skimming the surface, please subscribe. It takes an enormous amount of research and care to build something at this length, and every subscriber tells us that there is an audience for serious, patient storytelling. We believe that. We are counting on it. Now, one last thing before we begin. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to make it clean, to arrange the chaos of a continental land campaign into neat chapters of triumph and tragedy, to give every decision a clear consequence and every commander a fixed moral valence. War does not work that way. Campaigns do not work that way. Men do not work that way. What you are going to hear tonight is as honest as we can make it. The failures as well as the successes, the waste as well as the achievement. The moments when Patton's brilliance was indistinguishable from his recklessness, and the moments when his recklessness saved thousands of lives that a more cautious general would have spent on a slower, safer, bloodier approach. Third Army's story is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable one, but it is one of the great operational narratives of the Second World War, and it has never been told in full, all 18 chapters, from the general's arrival in England to the army's final position in the Bavarian foothills, in a single sitting. Until tonight. So close your eyes if you like, let the voice carry you. The trucks are loading in the English countryside. A cavalry officer who has spent his entire life preparing for this moment is walking the training grounds at night, alone, working through what he will do when they finally let him run. The story begins. He was not a man who arrived quietly. When George Smith Patton Jr. stepped onto English soil in 1943, he carried with him the weight of a reputation that preceded him like a storm front, magnetic, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire life rehearsing for a war that kept refusing to begin. His boots were always polished, his uniform was always precise, and his eyes, those pale, unsettling eyes, had a quality that made subordinates stand a little straighter and rivals look away first. He had spent decades in an army that rewarded patience and punished ambition, and he had survived that army by being better than it deserved. Now the world was finally burning in a way that required exactly what he had always been, and George Patton was not about to let the moment pass him by. To understand the man who would eventually command Third Army across France, you have to go back further than England, further even than the war itself. Patton came from California money and Virginia military tradition, raised on stories of Confederate generals and Roman cavalry commanders as though they were personal relatives rather than historical figures. He had competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm, finishing fifth overall in a competition that tested riding, shooting, fencing, swimming and running, a result he contested bitterly and memorably for the rest of his life. He attended West Point, graduated, and spent the years between the Great Wars mastering horsemanship, polo, swordsmanship, and the kind of tactical thinking that required a man to hold enormous complexity in his head while projecting absolute calm to those around him. He had redesigned the American cavalry saber. He had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, Stonewall Jackson, and Rommel with the same intensity a scholar might bring to ancient texts. He was, in the truest sense, a soldier who had never stopped studying war. By the time the Second World War began in earnest for America, Patton had already made himself the Army's leading expert in armoured warfare, a transition that some saw as natural and others saw as the desperate repositioning of a cavalryman whose horses had been made obsolete by the internal combustion engine. He saw it differently. For Patton, the tank was simply the horse reborn in steel. The principles he had always believed in, speed, shock, relentless forward pressure, the willingness to move before the enemy could think, translated perfectly into mechanized combat. While other officers approached armor cautiously, treating tanks as support weapons for the infantry, Patton had been arguing for years that armored formations could operate as independent striking forces, slashing through enemy lines and driving deep into undefended territory before the enemy's command structure could respond. It was a theory that would eventually prove itself across hundreds of kilometers of French countryside. But in the early months of the war, it was still just a theory, and Patton was still just a general who talked too loudly and believed too completely in his own destiny. His early record in the war was complicated. In North Africa, commanding the Second Corps after its disastrous defeat at the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, Patton had proven that his methods worked, that a broken, demoralized force could be hammered back into fighting shape through relentless discipline, aggressive training, and the sheer force of a commander's personality imposed on every level of the organization. He had taken a humiliated army and made it competitive in a matter of weeks, a transformation that earned him genuine admiration from those who watched it happen. Then came Sicily in the summer of 1943, where Patton commanded the 7th Army in a campaign that was brilliant in its operational imagination and disastrous in its public consequences. His forces moved faster and farther than anyone expected, racing the British 8th Army to Messina in a competition that he won decisively. And then, in 2 separate incidents at field hospitals, Patton slapped soldiers he believed were malingering, men who were listed as suffering from combat exhaustion, a condition that Patton privately refused to accept as legitimate. The slapping incidents, as they came to be known, nearly ended his career. The story reached the American press, and the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured into Washington demanding his dismissal. Congressmen called for his removal. Eisenhower, his superior and his friend, was furious, not simply because Patton had struck an enlisted man, which was serious enough, but because the incident threatened to become a political crisis at the worst possible moment. Eisenhower privately believed Patton was irreplaceable as a combat commander. He also privately believed that Patton had almost no ability to govern the impulses that made him dangerous to himself. The compromise that emerged was a public apology, delivered by Patton to the men of the 7th Army in a scene that must have cost him something profound, and a period of enforced idleness while other generals received the commands that Patton believed should have been his. He watched Omar Bradley, his former subordinate, receive command of the American ground forces for the Normandy invasion. He watched carefully, and he said very little, and those who knew him well understood that the silence was the most dangerous thing about him. It was in this condition, shamed, sidelined, burning with barely suppressed fury, that Patton arrived in England in 1943, officially in disgrace and unofficially indispensable. The Allied High Command faced a genuine dilemma. German intelligence had assessed Patton as the most dangerous American general in the European theatre. Field Marshal Rommel had studied his North Africa and Sicily campaigns and concluded that Patton was the only American commander who thought in the bold, operational terms that the Germans themselves had pioneered. To remove Patton entirely from the European theatre would be to hand the Germans an intelligence gift, confirmation that their most feared opponent was gone, and so the Allies made a different decision entirely. They would keep Patton visible, keep him prominent, and use the German fear of him as a weapon. The result was Operation Fortitude, the vast Allied deception designed to convince German High Command that the main invasion of France would come not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais. At the center of Fortitude was a fictional formation called the 1st United States Army Group, a ghost army of inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and invented order of battle that existed entirely in German intelligence files. And commanding this phantom force, at least in German eyes, was General George S. Patton, the man they most feared, placed precisely where they most expected the real blow to fall. It was, in a peculiar way, the most powerful role Patton had ever been given. He commanded nothing and everything simultaneously. Every public appearance he made in England, every speech to troops he delivered, every glimpse the press caught of his ivory-handled revolvers and his burnished helmet, fed German anxiety about where and when Patton's force would actually strike. He became a weapon made of rumor and reputation, and for a man who had always wanted to be at the center of the war, it was an almost unbearable irony. During these months of waiting, Patton did not slow down. He studied. He argued. He visited units, inspected equipment, and delivered the kind of speeches that soldiers talked about for decades afterward. Profane, theatrical, genuinely inspiring in ways that more polished commanders could never quite replicate. He had a gift for language that cut through the distance between a general and a private soldier, a talent for making men feel that the cause they were fighting for was both historically enormous and personally urgent. He could speak to a formation of 10,000 men and make each individual feel that he had been addressed directly. It was not a technique he had learned. It was simply how he thought, and the soldiers heard the authenticity in it, even when the profanity made the chaplains wince. But the waiting ground him down in ways he rarely acknowledged openly. He was a man built for action, physically restless, psychologically dependent on the rhythm of advance and decision that combat provided. The enforced stillness of England, the meetings, the diplomatic requirements, the careful management of his own image, ran against every instinct he possessed. He wrote letters home that mixed professional analysis with passages of startling vulnerability, confessing doubts he would never have voiced to a subordinate. He believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who has committed his entire identity to a single idea, that he had been born for this war. He had read military history deeply enough to know that wars did not last forever, that opportunities closed, that careers could be defined or destroyed by a single season of mischances. Every week that passed without a command felt like a door slowly swinging shut. What sustained him, perhaps, was the knowledge that the senior Allied leadership had not actually discarded him. Eisenhower wrote to him with a careful warmth that acknowledged both his indispensability and the conditions attached to it. Bradley kept him informed of planning developments. the staff work for the Third Army's eventual activation moved forward, quietly and methodically, building the organizational structure that would eventually house 300,000 men and hundreds of armored vehicles. Patton reviewed the planning documents with the focus of a man who knows exactly what he is preparing for, marking, questioning, demanding specificity from logistics officers who were unused to a general who understood their numbers as well as they did. There is something worth holding in this moment, before the battles begin and the legend solidifies. Here was a man that the army had nearly thrown away, standing in cold English air, studying maps of a country he had not yet been permitted to enter in force, commanding a force that did not yet officially exist, in a war that was still very much in doubt. He was ridiculous to some and terrifying to others, and understood by almost nobody. He had failed publicly and recovered privately. He had been celebrated and humiliated, and celebrated again, and through all of it, the core of the man had remained absolutely consistent, the belief that speed was a weapon, that aggression was a strategy, that the purpose of an army was not to hold ground, but to destroy the enemy's ability to function before the enemy could destroy yours. He had believed these things as a young cavalry officer. He believed them still, here in the English cold, in 1943, with the whole war still ahead of him. And in the months to come, across the roads and rivers of France, those beliefs would be tested in ways that no training exercise, no theoretical framework, and no amount of historical study could fully prepare a man for. England in the early months of 1944 was a country holding its breath. Every airfield, every country lane, every muddy field had been requisitioned, converted, or commandeered in preparation for something enormous. And somewhere in that organized chaos, in the grey English countryside, a general whom the newspapers had already written off was quietly, methodically building an army. George Patton had arrived in England carrying the weight of public disgrace and private fury in equal measure. The slapping incidents in Sicily had made him radioactive in the eyes of the press, a liability to his superiors, and a subject of open mockery in the corridors where careers were decided. What the newspapers did not understand, and what his superiors understood all too well, was that Patton possessed something rarer than good manners. He possessed an instinct for armoured warfare so precise, so deeply internalized, that it bordered on the physical. Eisenhower had not brought him to England to display him. He had brought him because the coming campaign would demand exactly the kind of mind that spent its sleepless hours calculating the relationship between fuel consumption and the speed of exploitation. Patton was infuriating. He was also irreplaceable. The Third United States Army existed on paper long before it existed in reality. Headquarters staff officers worked through the winter months, assembling the administrative skeleton of a force that would eventually grow to encompass hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and a supply chain of almost incomprehensible complexity. The Army's structure followed the established American model: corps commands, each containing multiple divisions, each division a self-contained organism of infantry, artillery, engineers, signals, and support troops capable of operating independently for limited periods. But an army is more than its organizational chart. An army is the accumulated habits, the shared rhythms, the mutual trust or distrust between commanders who have never operated together at this scale. Building that was Patton's real work, and it could not be done with paperwork alone. The divisions that flowed into Third Army's command came from wildly different backgrounds. Some, like the 4th Armored Division, had trained relentlessly and developed a reputation for mechanized aggression that suited Patton's philosophy almost perfectly. Others arrived from the United States, still blinking at the rain, their training thorough on paper but untested against anything resembling actual combat. A handful of divisions carried the hard education of North Africa and Sicily in their bones, men who had learned the difference between training ground confidence and the flattened, careful awareness of soldiers who have been shot at and survived. Patton did not regard this mixture as a weakness. He regarded it as a material to be shaped, and he set about shaping it with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting far too long for something useful to do. His approach to command was almost theatrical in its deliberateness. He visited units constantly, arriving unannounced, inspecting equipment, speaking directly to junior officers and enlisted men with the kind of blunt, profane clarity that either galvanized a soldier or left him deeply unsettled. Patton did not believe in the slow accumulation of institutional confidence. He believed in shock, in the sudden realization that the man standing in front of you expected more than you thought you were capable of giving. Commanders who impressed him received his respect and his delegation. He gave them authority and expected results, intervening only when results failed to materialize. Commanders who did not impress him were relieved with a speed that struck some observers as brutal. To Patton, it was simply arithmetic. A poor commander cost lives and lost time, and time was the one resource he valued above all others. Training under Third Army in those months was governed by a single obsession: speed. Not recklessness. Patton was too experienced to confuse the two, but the kind of deliberate, controlled speed that comes from units that trust their flanks, know their communications, and have rehearsed the transition from march to attack so many times that it becomes muscle memory. Engineers practiced bridging operations. Tank crews drilled their maintenance routines until they could complete them in darkness. Artillery forward observers learned to call fire with the kind of confidence that only comes from repetition. Infantry and armor practiced the combined arms coordination that had been painfully absent in the early American engagements of the war. None of this was glamorous. Most of it was exhausting, repetitive, and conducted in English weather that seemed personally hostile to human morale. The logistics of feeding and supplying an army of this scale while it was still training presented its own particular form of organized nightmare. Supply officers worked to establish the chains of depots, vehicle parks, ammunition dumps, and fuel installations that would eventually need to stretch from the Normandy coast deep into France. They did this under the additional constraint that the exact location of the invasion beaches remained secret, meaning that much of their planning required careful improvisation around what they were not yet permitted to know. American industrial output was by now staggering. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and dozens of smaller cities were producing vehicles, ammunition, and equipment at rates that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But raw production meant nothing unless it could be moved, stored, and delivered to the right place at the right moment. The quartermasters and transport officers who solved these problems daily received none of the attention lavished on fighting generals. They were, nonetheless, building the foundations on which everything else would stand. Within Patton's own command structure, personalities complicated the work of creating coherence. Corps commanders brought their own doctrines, their own habits, and their own views on how armored forces should be employed. Some had already established reputations through earlier service. Others were building theirs from scratch in the English training areas, aware that their performance over the coming months would define their careers in ways that no peacetime appointment ever could. Patton managed these relationships with a complexity that his public image often obscured. The swaggering, theatrical general of newspaper legend was also a careful student of his subordinates' psychology. calibrating how much pressure each man could absorb and where his genuine strengths lay. He demanded aggressive thinking, but he also needed men who could execute, who could translate an order to advance rapidly into the actual, grinding, logistical reality of moving thousands of vehicles along roads that were never designed for military traffic. There was, threading through all of this, the strange unreality of Patton's official position. Officially, publicly, he remained a figure of controversy, a general under a cloud, someone the Allied command was tolerating rather than celebrating. The elaborate deception operation that had been constructed around him required that he be visible enough to attract German attention while remaining separate from the actual invasion planning in ways that could be plausibly maintained. German intelligence monitored him. The Wehrmacht's command structure had developed a healthy respect for Patton's capabilities in Sicily and North Africa, and the Allies intended to exploit that respect to its maximum possible value. So Patton performed the role of disgraced general in public, while building, in private, one of the most capable armored armies the American military had ever assembled. The irony was not lost on him. By the time June arrived, the army had taken on a kind of coherent identity that had not existed 6 months earlier. Men who had trained alongside each other through the grey English winter had developed the wordless familiarity that makes units function under pressure, the knowledge of who could be relied upon, who would hesitate, who would push beyond what was asked of them. The staff had smoothed the friction from its own processes, developing the communication rhythms and planning procedures that would allow them to function under the chaotic pressures of actual combat. Supply chains had been tested, revised, and tested again. Engineers had bridged rivers and unbridged them and bridged them once more. More than 300,000 men and their equipment waited in a country that had run out of room for any more waiting. The world, of course, did not know any of this. The world knew only that Patton had disgraced himself in Sicily and was being kept out of the way while more presentable generals prepared the invasion. The world watched the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June and paid attention to the names that appeared in the communiques: Bradley, Montgomery, the commanders of the assault divisions storming through the surf. Patton's name did not appear. He was still the ghost general, the threat that had not yet materialized, the weapon that remained sheathed. But the army he had built through months of demanding, unglamorous, exhausting work was ready. Every fuel truck meticulously organized, every bridge unit rehearsed, every armored crew trained to operate at a pace that would, when the moment finally came, leave the German command structure struggling to comprehend what was happening to it. The machinery was complete. What it needed now was the order to move. The 6th of June 1944, somewhere across the English Channel, the greatest amphibious operation in the history of warfare was unfolding in the grey, churning waters off the coast of Normandy. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers were crossing toward 5 beaches, facing steel and concrete and the guns of the Atlantic Wall. Paratroopers had already descended through the darkness. Naval shells were already tearing at German emplacements. Men were already dying in the surf. And George Smith Patton Jr. was sitting in England, reading the morning dispatches, unable to do a single thing about any of it. He had no army under his command that day, not a real one. What he had was a fiction, carefully constructed by Allied intelligence and maintained at enormous cost and effort. The first United States Army Group existed primarily on paper, in German radio intercepts, in the fabricated communications that British deception specialists fed like poison into the enemy's intelligence networks. German High Command believed that Patton, the Americans' most feared and most aggressive general, commanded a vast invasion force assembled in the southeast of England, poised to cross the narrowest stretch of the Channel and storm ashore at the Pas de Calais. That belief was the product of one of the most elaborate strategic deceptions ever mounted in wartime. The Germans called him a genius and a brute in the same breath, and they watched his phantom army with the anxious attention you reserve for a man who has already surprised you once. The deception had a name, Operation Quicksilver, a component of the broader Operation Bodyguard. Inflatable tanks sat in English fields, fake landing craft bobbed in harbours, carefully planted double agents filed reports confirming German fears. Patton himself made public appearances, gave speeches, and allowed himself to be seen, because his visibility in England was the point. If the Germans could place him there, commanding a force of enormous size, then Normandy could be dismissed as a feint, a distraction, and the real blow would still be coming at Pas de Calais. Every day Patton remained in England, and refrained from crossing to France reinforced that belief. Every day the German 15th Army stayed pinned in the north waiting for an attack that would never come, was a day it could not reinforce the beaches where American and British and Canadian soldiers were bleeding. It is difficult to fully appreciate what this demanded of him. Patton was not a patient man by nature, by training, or by philosophy. His entire theory of war was built on movement, on striking before the enemy could recover, on driving through gaps before they closed, on keeping the enemy so disoriented that he could never establish a coherent defense. He had studied cavalry warfare, had admired the great captains of history, precisely because they understood that momentum was its own kind of weapon. Now his country's greatest gamble in a generation was unfolding across 20 miles of open water, and his orders required him to remain still, to watch, to wait, to be a ghost. The men actually fighting that day answered to other commanders. Omar Bradley directed the American beaches at Omaha and Utah. British and Canadian forces pushed inland from Gold, Juno, and Sword under their own senior officers. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had the unenviable task of holding this coalition together, had made his decision about who would fight on the 6th of June. Patton was not among them. The decision was not arbitrary. His value to the deception was, in the cold arithmetic of strategic planning, worth more than his presence on any beach. Thousands of German soldiers held in place north of the Seine were worth divisions, potentially the entire margin of survival in those first critical hours on the coast. Patton understood this. That did not make it easier to bear. Those who knew him in those weeks described a man barely held in check. He read everything. He studied maps with the intensity of a scholar preparing for an examination he was not permitted to sit. He convened his senior staff and ran planning exercises, worked through hypothetical operational scenarios, refined the doctrine that his Third Army would eventually carry into France. In some ways, the enforced stillness gave him time to think at a level that the chaos of active command never quite allows, to stress test supply assumptions, to examine the terrain east of Normandy, to consider how a breakout might unfold and what exploitation might look like when the moment finally came. He used the waiting, but he hated it. The reports coming back from Normandy in those first days were not uniformly encouraging. Omaha Beach, in particular, had cost the Americans dearly. Men of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division had waded ashore under murderous fire, the plan unraveling almost immediately upon contact with reality. The bluffs above the beach had not been neutralized by the preliminary bombardment. Landing craft had deposited soldiers in the wrong places or swamped in the surf before reaching the shore. The toll was devastating. Patton read these reports, and what he felt was almost surely a complicated mixture of things: grief for the men, professional analysis of what had gone wrong, and underneath it all, a conviction that he would have found a way to hit harder and move faster. Whether he was right is a question that history cannot cleanly answer. What is certain is that he believed it completely. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the deception was holding. German commanders remained convinced that the Normandy landings were in fact a diversion, that the main assault force, Patton's force, had not yet moved. Adolf Hitler himself, despite pressure from his field commanders, refused to authorize the release of armoured reserves in the critical hours after the landings. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most powerful armoured formations in the Wehrmacht, sat waiting for orders that came too late to matter. Weeks would pass before German High Command fully accepted that Normandy was not a feint. By then, the Allied bridgehead would be consolidated, the beachhead supplied, and the conditions for breakout already beginning to form. One man's enforced absence from the battle had shaped its outcome more than his presence might have. By mid-June, as the bridgehead stabilized and the brutal grinding battle of the Bocage began, Patton's situation grew almost untenable. Other officers he had known for years were earning their reputations in Normandy. Younger men were commanding divisions in combat. The war he had spent his entire adult life preparing for, was being fought without him, and the window of opportunity, it must have seemed, could close. He had been recalled from disgrace once, elevated to command of a paper army that served a strategic purpose he could not publicly acknowledge. But paper armies do not win campaigns. Reputations are built in the field, not in English country houses with maps on the walls and no shots being fired. He was also acutely aware of his own age and the arithmetic of time. A man in his late 50s, regardless of his physical vigor, cannot assume unlimited future opportunities. This war was the war of his generation, perhaps the war of all generations, in the scope of what it meant for civilization. He had come too far, survived the slapping incidents and the humiliation of public disgrace, endured the months of organizational labor and political navigation, to now watch the decisive campaign of the century from across the English Channel. The frustration was not mere ego, though ego was surely present in abundance. It was the frustration of a craftsman watching his craft practiced by others while his own hands stayed idle. Then, quietly, the preparations began to shift. Orders filtered down through Eisenhower's headquarters. The planning for Third Army's activation in France became less theoretical and more operational. Maps were updated. Liaison officers traveled between England and the growing logistical infrastructure behind the Normandy beachhead. Patton himself received indications, not yet formal orders, that his time of waiting was drawing toward a close. The deception still needed to hold for several more weeks. Every additional week the Germans remained uncertain about Pas-de-Calais was a week the beachhead grew stronger, but the end game of Patton's enforced patience was becoming visible on the horizon. He began planning not in the abstract, but in the specific. Where would his army enter France? Which routes would it use? How fast could it realistically move? And how much faster could it move if everything went well? That was the question that animated everything Patton thought and planned during those long weeks. How fast? Not whether his army could fight, that was a given, or at least a premise he was unwilling to question, but speed. Speed as a weapon, speed as a force multiplier, speed as the thing that turned tactical victories into operational catastrophe for the enemy. The German army, for all its professional skill, could not defend against an opponent who moved faster than it could respond. That was the insight at the center of his military philosophy, and the weeks of waiting had only sharpened his conviction. When Third Army finally crossed to France and took its place in the line, It would not move cautiously. It would not pause to consolidate when consolidation could wait. It would move and keep moving and discover the outer edge of what was possible only by reaching it. The 6th of June 1944 had come and gone without him, but the 6th of June was an opening, not an ending. The door into France had been forced at enormous cost by other men on other beaches, and Patton respected that cost even as he chafed at his own distance from it. The armies now struggling through the hedgerows of Normandy were creating the conditions for everything that would follow, and what would follow: the breakout, the pursuit, the race across the open country of France. That was the kind of war Patton had spent a lifetime learning how to fight. The waiting was almost over. For months, George Patton had watched from the margins. He had studied maps he was not allowed to act upon, issued orders to armies that existed only on paper, and played the role of a decoy with the discipline of a man who understood, however bitterly, the larger game being played around him. But by the final days of July 1944, the waiting was over. The Normandy breakout had begun. The American First Army had punched through at Saint-Lô, and the corridor that opened in the German lines was exactly the kind of gap that Patton had spent his entire military life preparing to exploit. Supreme Commander Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley had a plan, and at the center of that plan, finally, was the Third United States Army. On the 1st of August 1944, Third Army was officially activated. Patton assumed command. He did not waste a single hour. The ground that Third Army now inherited was nothing like the Normandy the world had watched bleed through June and July. The Bocage country, those ancient, tangled hedgerows that had turned every French field into a fortress, still existed to the north and east. But where the breakout had torn the German front apart, the land opened. Roads stretched south and west into Brittany, and beyond Brittany lay the Atlantic ports that Allied planners believed would be essential for sustaining the campaign. Patton looked at his maps and saw not a peninsula to be cautiously cleared, but a void to be filled at speed. His instinct, as it always was forward. His divisions would not creep through the countryside feeling for resistance. They would drive through it, around it, and past it, leaving pockets of confused German defenders to be mopped up by forces coming behind. Speed was the weapon. Speed was the armor. Speed was everything. The man Patton chose to lead his armored spearhead into Brittany was Major General John S. Wood, commanding the 4th Armored Division, and Wood was perhaps the only subordinate commander who understood mobile warfare at the same instinctive level as Patton himself. Wood's tankers moved in a way that German defenders simply could not process. Rather than pausing to consolidate after each advance, the 4th Armored kept pushing, columns of Sherman tanks grinding forward through the summer heat, bypassing towns, ignoring their flanks, trusting that speed itself was a form of security. German forces attempting to establish blocking positions found that the Americans had already passed them, were already behind them, were already threatening the next town down the road. It was a form of warfare that turned the enemy's orientation against him, rendering his prepared defenses irrelevant before they could be occupied. Within the first 72 hours of Third Army's activation, American armored columns had advanced distances that had taken the entire First Army weeks to achieve in the Bocage. The contrast was not lost on the men doing the fighting. Soldiers who had spent agonizing weeks taking single hedgerow lines began to experience something they had almost forgotten was possible: the sensation of winning, and winning quickly. Pontoons and bridges stretched across rivers that German planners had expected to hold for days. Fuel trucks raced forward through clouds of dust, to keep the tanks moving. Patton drove through his own columns in his command vehicle, appearing without warning at crossroads and forward command posts, his voice cutting through the noise, his presence alone enough to accelerate the pace of men who were already moving fast. He seemed, to the soldiers who saw him, to be everywhere at once. The Brittany Peninsula itself presented Patton with a problem that was almost more political than military. Allied supply planning had identified the great Atlantic ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, as critical to sustaining the campaign through the autumn and winter. Capturing those ports meant clearing German garrisons that had been ordered to defend them to the last man. Patton assigned forces sufficient to mask and eventually reduce those fortifications, but he refused to commit the bulk of his strength to what he recognized as a siege operation. Brest in particular was defended by a determined German garrison that would not surrender for weeks. Patton contained it and moved on. The port objectives, important as they were to Allied planners in theory, mattered less to Patton than the open ground to the east, where the real war was being decided. The speed of Third Army's advance created problems that were, in their own way, as challenging as enemy resistance. Columns of vehicles stretched for kilometers along roads never designed for military traffic, and coordination between divisions advancing on parallel routes required constant radio communication and careful traffic management. The Army's engineers worked around the clock repairing bridges, laying temporary roads, and keeping the arteries of advance open against the pressure of constant use. Supply sergeants performed calculations that bordered on the miraculous, stretching fuel allocations that should not have reached as far as they did, improvising distribution points in fields that had been German-held 2 days before. The army was moving faster than its own administrative structure had been designed to support, and it was doing so through a combination of institutional ingenuity and the sheer determination of men who could feel the momentum of victory beneath them. German command in Brittany had collapsed into confusion that Patton's speed made permanent. German divisional and regimental commanders, attempting to establish coherent defensive lines, found that the situation had changed by the time their orders reached their subordinates. American armored columns were already flanking positions that German infantry had not yet fully occupied. Communications were disrupted by Allied air interdiction and by the simple fact that the front was moving too quickly for German signals networks to follow. The Wehrmacht formations, that had been formidable in the static defensive warfare of Normandy, were encountering a kind of warfare they had not prepared for and could not adjust to in time. Patton had always argued that a disorganized enemy is not an enemy at all, but an opportunity, and in Brittany, that argument was being proven correct at every crossroads and river crossing. Allied air power amplified the ground advance in ways that Patton had always understood but could now demonstrate with real evidence. Tactical aircraft from the 9th Air Force ranged ahead of the armored columns, striking German vehicle convoys, disrupting supply routes, and forcing German commanders to move only at night or not at all. Columns of German transport caught in the open on Breton roads provided evidence of what air superiority meant when applied in coordination with advancing ground forces. The German soldier in Brittany in early August 1944 was simultaneously outflanked on the ground and hunted from the air, and the psychological effect of that combination was corrosive to any organized resistance. Men who might have held a defensive line given time and preparation had neither, and they knew it. Patton moved his command post repeatedly, pushing it forward to stay close to the action and to signal to his corps commanders that there was no such thing as a comfortable distance from the front. He communicated with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding, and he had little patience for commanders who arrived at briefings with problems instead of solutions. He expected his subordinates to solve difficulties at their own level and to report back with what they had done, rather than with what they needed permission to do. This created an army culture that valued initiative and speed over caution, that treated the map not as a picture of what existed, but as a target for what would exist by nightfall. It was a culture that worked because Patton himself embodied it completely, without reservation or performance. By mid-August, the Brittany operation had achieved what could be achieved within Patton's philosophy. The peninsula had been effectively cut off, the major ports were under siege or containment, and the Third Army's attention was already swinging east, toward the Seine, toward Paris, toward Germany. The port garrisons would hold out longer than Allied planners had hoped, and some of the logistical assumptions built around Brittany's harbours would prove optimistic. But Patton had accomplished something more significant than the capture of any individual objective. He had demonstrated, in conditions of actual combat against a capable enemy, that the principles he had spent years articulating were not theoretical propositions, they were operational realities. Armoured forces, properly led and supplied, could move faster than a defender could respond. Speed was not recklessness. Speed was decisive. The men of Third Army carried something eastward with them out of Brittany that could not be measured in kilometers or captured ports. They carried the knowledge that they had been part of something that worked, something that moved, something that had broken the grinding logic of the defensive war that had characterized the first weeks in France. Soldiers who had crawled through hedgerows in June were riding on tank decks in August, watching the countryside blur past at a pace that felt almost impossible. NCOs who had learned to measure progress in single fields now thought in terms of towns, rivers, and provinces. The army had found its rhythm, and that rhythm matched the tempo of the one man who had been telling anyone who would listen, for years before the first gun fired, exactly how this was supposed to work. George Patton had not simply proven his critics wrong. He had replaced their entire framework for imagining what an army could do. By the middle of August 1944, the German position in Normandy had passed from desperate to catastrophic, though not every commander on the German side had accepted that truth. Adolf Hitler, directing operations from his Wolf's Lair headquarters more than 1,000 kilometers to the east, had convinced himself that a single decisive armoured thrust could still reverse the tide in the west. His generals in the field knew better. They had been trading ground for weeks, bleeding their best panzer divisions against an enemy with air superiority, endless ammunition, and a general named Patton who seemed physically incapable of stopping. But orders from the Wolf's Lair were not suggestions. On the 7th of August, the German 7th Army launched Operation Lüttich, a concentrated armour attack aimed westward through the town of Mortagne, with the ultimate objective of reaching Avranches and severing the American supply corridor entirely. On paper, it was a stroke of strategic boldness. On the ground in Normandy, in the summer heat, against American air power and infantry dug into every stone wall and hedgerow, it was something closer to a last wish. The American defenders at Mortagne held on with extraordinary stubbornness. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division bore the initial shock of the German armoured columns, fighting through the night and into the following day, while communications crackled with calls for support. They were surrounded on ground they refused to yield. American fighter bombers, the famous Typhoons and Thunderbolts that had haunted every German column movement for weeks, descended on the advancing panzers as soon as morning light permitted. Burning German armour lined the roads leading into Mortagne within hours of the attack's opening. The counteroffensive that Hitler had hoped would smash American lines and reclaim the initiative instead revealed the German 7th Army's most powerful remaining armoured forces in the open, exposed and vulnerable. For Patton, watching the battle maps in his command caravan, the German move looked less like a threat and more like an extraordinary gift. He had already been pushing his Third Army eastward and south, bypassing resistance wherever possible, pursuing speed as a tactical philosophy rather than a luxury. Now, staring at the German salient driving west toward Mortain, Patton grasped the geometrical reality before most of his peers could articulate it. The Germans had committed their weight westward. Their flanks were exposed. Their rear was open. If the Third Army could continue swinging east and then north, curving like a fist closing around the German rear, the entire German force in Normandy could be encircled, not pushed back, not defeated in detail, but encircled and destroyed. He reportedly told his staff something to the effect that the enemy had walked straight into a trap of his own making. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the clarity of his thinking was not in question. He started making calls that same morning. Patton directed his forces to maintain their eastern drive even as the battle at Mortain continued. The key objective that crystallized in Allied planning was the town of Argentan, roughly 40 kilometers south of Falaise. If American forces could take Argentan while Canadian and British forces pushed south from Falaise, the German pocket would be closed. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers cut off from supply, reinforcement, and retreat. The boundary between American and British-Canadian operational zones ran roughly through this corridor, and the race to close the gap became one of the most intensely scrutinized decisions of the entire Normandy campaign. Patton's armoured columns reached the Argentan area well ahead of the Canadians closing from the north, but orders from Supreme Headquarters halted the American advance at the boundary line. His forces were told to stop. They were not to cross into the British-Canadian zone without authorization. Patton, famously, was livid. The halt at Argentan became one of the most debated operational decisions of the war in the West. Those who defended the order pointed to the very real danger of American and Canadian forces colliding in the dark and the fog of battle. Fratricide, not victory, would follow if two armies drove blindly toward each other without coordination. Those who agreed with Patton argued that the chance to close the pocket completely was being sacrificed on the altar of caution and inter-allied protocol. The truth almost surely contained elements of both. What is certain is that the German pocket did not close cleanly, and the gap between Argentan and Falaise remained open for critical days. German forces, recognizing the trap beginning to form around them, began streaming eastward through that gap with desperate urgency, abandoning equipment, leaving their wounded, moving in columns that were hammered from the air but never fully stopped. The escape was not complete, but neither was the encirclement. Inside the pocket itself, the conditions bore no resemblance to the organized fighting retreat that German commanders attempted to describe in their communiques. The roads were choked with vehicles, horse-drawn artillery, supply wagons, and men on foot, all moving under a sky that belonged entirely to Allied air power. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a protective force over the battlefield. American and British aircraft worked in rotation, attacking anything that moved on the roads leading east. The destruction accumulating in the sunken Norman lanes and along the river valleys inside the pocket was of a scale that stunned even veterans of earlier campaigns. German soldiers from formations that had held the line for months against everything the Allies threw at them were now being destroyed not in battle but in movement, caught in the open, trying simply to get away. Patton's corps commanders worked the southern edge of the pocket with relentless pressure. The objective was not simply to contain the Germans, but to accelerate their destruction and minimize the number who reached safety on the far side. Every kilometre of the pocket's southern wall that Third Army could push inward shortened the gap and increased the pressure on those trying to escape. Divisions that had been in continuous contact since the Brittany breakout 3 weeks earlier were being asked to fight again, to advance again, to hold again, without meaningful rest, with supply lines already strained from the speed of the advance, and with the summer heat turning the roads to dust and the air inside armoured vehicles into something close to an oven. The men kept moving, the commanders kept pushing. Patton's personal style of leadership, appearing at forward command posts, demanding answers, tolerating neither excuses nor pessimism, set the tempo for the entire army. On the Canadian side, the advance from Falaise southward proved far more difficult than Allied planners had anticipated. German formations, including some of the most capable SS Panzer units remaining in Normandy, had been repositioned to hold the northern shoulder of the corridor open precisely long enough to allow a maximum number of their comrades to escape. The fighting north of Falaise was vicious and costly for the Canadians, who pushed through it nonetheless with considerable determination. The town of Falaise itself fell in the middle of August, but the gap south of it remained contested for several more days. Allied bombing inadvertently struck Canadian positions on at least one occasion during this period, adding a grim and costly dimension to an already complicated battle. The pocket was closing, but the closing was ugly, uneven, and far from the clean encirclement that the maps had suggested was possible. By the 19th and 20th of August, the gap had narrowed to a matter of kilometres. Polish armoured forces fighting under Canadian command drove to a piece of high ground near the town of Chambois and linked with American elements pressing northward from Argentan, effectively sealing the pocket. What remained inside was no longer an army in any operational sense. It was a mass of men and equipment in various stages of destruction and surrender. German soldiers who had survived the aerial attacks and the artillery barrages found themselves surrounded, without ammunition, without food, and with their chain of command shattered at almost every level. Thousands surrendered. Thousands more had already been killed on the roads east of Falaise in the preceding days. The fortunate ones, and fortune is a relative word in this context, were those who had made it through the gap before it closed. The numbers that ultimately escaped the Falaise pocket have been debated by historians ever since. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 German soldiers fought their way out before the closing, though they left behind nearly all of their heavy equipment, their cohesion, and much of their fighting strength. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army emerged from the pocket as shadows of their former selves, capable of occupying defensive positions but not of serious offensive action for weeks to come. Perhaps 20,000 German soldiers were captured inside the pocket. The dead were counted not precisely, but by inference, by the wreckage that filled every road and field across a stretch of Norman countryside that civilians would not return to for weeks. The French villages caught between the armies paid a price of their own that no operational summary fully captures. For Patton, the battle's conclusion carried the particular bitterness of incomplete triumph. He had seen the encirclement forming before almost anyone else, had positioned his forces to exploit it, and had watched the escape gap remain open, in part because of decisions made above his level of command. He did not let that frustration remain private. His remarks about the missed opportunity, delivered to his staff and eventually finding their way into diaries and post-war memoirs, were characteristically unambiguous. He believed a larger number of German forces could and should have been destroyed in the pocket, and he was probably correct. But the campaign was not finished, and the army that had been half destroyed at Falaise was not the same force that would need to be beaten next. Paris lay ahead. The Seine lay ahead. The Rhine, though still far, was no longer an abstraction. The pocket at Falaise had broken the German capacity to defend France. What came next would determine whether it was also the beginning of the end for the Reich itself. Patton was already studying the maps for that next question before the last German prisoners had been counted at Chambois. There is a moment in every campaign when a city stops being a coordinate on a map and becomes something else entirely. Paris had always carried weight, not merely as a capital, but as an idea, a civilization compressed into streets and boulevards, into cathedral stone and café light. By late August of 1944, it had endured more than 4 years under German occupation, and the question of who would walk through it first was no longer purely military. It was political, it was symbolic, and for the generals racing westward across France, it was becoming something dangerously close to personal. Patton understood cities the way a cavalryman understood terrain, not as destinations to be savoured, but as objectives to be seized and passed through on the way to something more decisive. His instinct was always to go around, to bypass, to keep the enemy off balance and the army moving. Paris, in that cold strategic calculus, was a liability as much as a prize. A city of more than 2 million people would need to be fed, policed, and administered the moment it was liberated, and every ton of food trucked into Paris was a ton of fuel that never reached the forward elements of Third Army. Patton had made his feelings clear, but the French had other ideas, and Eisenhower, ever the balancer of competing pressures, was about to make a decision that would override cold logic with political necessity. General Charles de Gaulle, commanding the Free French forces and the political authority of a France not yet reborn, had been pressing the Allied Supreme Command for weeks. The liberation of Paris could not be left to accident or afterthought. It had to be deliberate, ceremonial, and unmistakably French. There were also darker pressures at work. The resistance inside Paris had risen, striking at German garrisons across the city, and the German military governor faced a choice between brutal suppression and negotiated withdrawal. Reports reaching Allied headquarters suggested the city might be torn apart from within before any liberating army could arrive. The situation was accelerating beyond the neat boundaries of anyone's operational plan. What had been a question of when was rapidly becoming a question of hours. Into this charged atmosphere rode multiple American corps, advancing on separate axes through the rolling French countryside south and west of the capital. Patton's Third Army was not the only force in motion. The First United States Army under General Courtney Hodges was also pushing northeast, and the two armies moved in loose parallel, their boundaries overlapping in the confusion of rapid advance. The competition was real, if unspoken. Commanders at corps and division level knew that the unit entering Paris first would carry that distinction forever, inscribed into regimental histories and veterans' memories long after the operational details had faded. Flags and press photographs and the roar of liberated crowds would belong to whoever arrived first. That was a currency no soldier could pretend to be indifferent to. Patton's corps moved with the rhythm that had defined Third Army since Avranches, fast, aggressive, willing to accept friction as the price of momentum. His formations were strung across a wide front, each pushing along its assigned axis, probing for gaps, exploiting weakness, accelerating through the spaces where German resistance had evaporated and slowing only where it had not. The roads through the French countryside were crowded with the materials of both armies, fuel convoys grinding northward, ambulances moving south, jeeps threading between columns of infantry whose boots had worn through hundreds of kilometers of European road. The advance was exhilarating and exhausting in the same breath, a kind of controlled chaos that Patton had always believed in more than the tidy movements of the textbook. On the German side, the picture was one of dissolving coherence. The catastrophe of the Falaise pocket had shattered the organized fighting strength of German forces in Normandy, and what remained was streaming eastward in fragments, units separated from their commands, commanders operating without communications, men who had survived encirclement only to find themselves in open retreat through a countryside that no longer offered cover or support. The German garrison in Paris was itself in an uncertain state, receiving contradictory orders from a high command that was itself in turmoil. Hitler had issued explicit orders. Paris was to be held, and if it could not be held, it was to be destroyed. The bridges were to be blown. The monuments were to come down. The city that had fed the occupiers' vanity for 4 years was to be denied to the liberator. Those orders were not carried out. The reasons are complicated, human, and ultimately more interesting than the orders themselves. As American formations drew closer, the pressure on Eisenhower became impossible to resist. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armoured Division, attached to the 1st American Army, was positioned and ready, its men burning with a specific desire that no other formation could claim. They were going home. The decision came from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, with the weight of political calculation and genuine military urgency. The rising inside Paris could not be left to collapse without Allied intervention. Leclerc's division would lead the entry into the city, with American forces moving in close support. It was, in every dimension, the right call. It was also a decision that pulled resources and attention toward Paris, at a moment when Patton believed those resources belonged further east, driving toward Germany while the German army was still reeling. Patton did not hide his frustration. He never did. In his command vehicle, in his headquarters, in the blunt dispatches he sent upward through the chain of command, the message was consistent. Paris was a diversion, and every day spent celebrating a liberation was a day the Germans used to rebuild. He was not wrong, exactly. The operational logic was real. German engineers were working without pause to establish new defensive lines east of Paris, turning rivers and ridgelines into the bones of a new defensive architecture. Every hour mattered, but the war was also being fought in the minds of nations, in the legitimacy of governments, in the question of what Europe would become when the guns finally stopped. Paris was not just a city. Patton, who had studied military history with genuine depth, understood this even as he resented it. The liberation itself came in the final days of August. Leclerc's armoured columns pushing through the outskirts of the city into scenes that defied the vocabulary of military reporting. People poured into the streets as if the city had been holding its breath for 4 years and could finally exhale. Flowers, wine, embraces, tears. The full force of a population's relief expressed in hours. The German garrison surrendered in fragments, and the bridges stood intact, the threatened destruction never carried out. Paris was whole, and then the formal ceremonies came, the marching columns and the flags, and the photographs that would define the liberation in public memory for generations. Patton watched from elsewhere, pushing his formations eastward, already thinking about the Meuse, already calculating what speed required. But the effects of the Paris operation rippled through every American formation in France. The logistical demands of feeding and supplying a newly liberated capital of more than 2 million people were immediate and enormous. Supplies that might have gone east went instead to Paris, a redirection of tonnage that was felt acutely at the sharp end of every advancing division. Fuel, always the limiting factor in Patton's kind of warfare, became even harder to allocate. The trucks of the Red Ball Express, the improvised supply artery running from the Normandy beaches, were carrying at their maximum capacity and still falling short of what the advancing armies demanded. Paris had been won, but the price was paid in momentum, and momentum was the currency Patton valued above everything else. There was something almost elegiac in the moment, though Patton himself would never have used that word. Third Army had broken out of Normandy, swallowed Brittany, pivoted east, trapped a German army, and now stood within reach of a river, the Seine, that marked a genuine threshold. On the western side of that river lay the campaign of summer, fast and brilliant, and already slipping into memory. On the eastern side lay a different kind of war, harder and slower and colder, waiting in the autumn that was already tightening the light over the French countryside. The men who had raced across France in the heat of August would need to become different soldiers, patient, durable, capable of grinding where they had once sprinted. Patton was not yet ready to accept that. The momentum felt real, felt sustainable, felt like something that could carry an army all the way to Berlin before the leaves fell. Paris was free. The crowds had cheered, and the flags had come out from wherever they had been hidden through 4 years of occupation. In the larger story of the war, it was a moment that needed no qualification. A great city returned to itself. A people returned to the possibility of their own future. But in the operational diary of Third Army, Paris was already receding, a fixed point the army had passed and would not return to. Ahead lay the Seine, and beyond it the Meuse, and beyond that the German border itself, and Patton was already there in his mind, already pacing the distances, already measuring what speed could still accomplish before the war's arithmetic shifted against him. The Seine River stands before them like a final test, a barrier of dark water that has slowed armies for centuries. By late August in 1944, Patton's Third Army has already shattered the German lines in Brittany, trapped tens of thousands of enemy soldiers in the Falaise pocket, and driven deep into the heart of occupied France with a speed that has left even the most optimistic commanders breathless. But now, as spearheads of American armor and infantry reach the river's banks, the momentum encounters physics. A river cannot be crossed at 60 kilometers per hour. The Seine, flowing north toward the English Channel, cuts across the path of every corps in Third Army, a wet obstacle that demands methodical planning, careful coordination, and timing more precise than the fluid maneuvers of the previous weeks. For soldiers trained to move, to push forward, to maintain momentum, a river crossing represents a forced pause, a moment when the pursuing army must halt, gather resources, and prepare to assault across contested ground. It is in these moments that commanders are tested not by their boldness, but by their ability to orchestrate logistics, engineering, and timing under pressure and against an enemy desperate to slow them down. The technical challenge is immense and unforgiving. The Seine at this season carries considerable flow, its current strong enough to complicate crossing operations. The Germans, retreating but not yet defeated, have destroyed many of the permanent bridges. Concrete structures that once carried traffic from Paris toward the Channel now sit broken in the water, their spans collapsed or heavily damaged. This forces Patton's engineers to construct temporary crossings from scratch. Pontoon bridges must be assembled from floating sections towed in trucks, positioned in the current, anchored against the flow, and tested under the weight of tanks and trucks and ammunition carriers rolling across their canvas decks. Each pontoon crossing takes hours to construct and can support only limited weight at limited speed. The engineers themselves become frontline soldiers, working under artillery fire and small arms fire from German positions on the far bank, exposed on the water where there is nowhere to hide. Behind them, Division after division of infantry and armor backs up, waiting for their chance to cross, pressed forward by commanders aware that every hour of delay means the Germans escape further east, that every mile not covered today must be made up tomorrow, that the window of opportunity for rapid breakthrough closes as German reserves consolidate and establish new defensive lines. The complexity multiplies when multiple divisions compete for limited crossing sites. Patton has assembled a massive force, more than 300,000 men, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, all needing to flow across a river through narrow corridors controlled by a handful of pontoon bridges and a few remaining intact road bridges that engineers can repair. The math is brutal. A division takes hours to cross. 2 divisions need coordination to avoid traffic jams and chaos. 3 divisions crossing simultaneously at different points require perfect synchronization of supplies, ammunition delivery, and traffic control, or the whole operation collapses into congestion that halts everything. Corps commanders argue with each other over which division crosses when, which crossing point gets priority, whose supply trucks get precedence on the pontoon bridges. The logistics staff must choreograph not just the assault, but the supply lines that will feed the crossing force once it is on the far bank, fuel for tanks and trucks, ammunition for every gun, food and water for tens of thousands of soldiers. Without that supply stream crossing the Seine, the bridgeheads cannot expand. Without expanding bridgeheads, the exploitation stalls. Patton drives this coordination relentlessly, visiting division and corps headquarters, pushing commanders to move faster, accept more risk, compress timelines that seem already compressed to the breaking point. The crossing begins not with thunderous assaults but with engineer reconnaissance, small teams of men crossing the river at night in rubber boats, probing German positions, identifying strong points and areas of lighter resistance. This is quiet, dangerous work. Men in darkness on water, knowing that if they are discovered, the entire operation becomes more costly. The engineers plant charges on partially destroyed bridges, preparing them for repair or final demolition if the Germans attempt counterattacks. They identify locations for pontoon bridges, places where the terrain will support anchoring, where roads lead from the crossing site and can be rapidly repaired or improved for heavy vehicle traffic. They measure the current, estimate weight limits, and calculate how many hours will be needed for construction under fire. Then the actual assault begins. Infantry units cross first, sometimes in boats, sometimes on partially repaired bridges or temporary structures, establishing foothold positions on the eastern bank. German defenders, now in retreat but still organized in pockets and defensive lines, resist fiercely in places and fall back without fighting in others. The American infantry drives inland from the river, securing the far bank for a wider and wider distance, preparing the way for engineers to construct and maintain the bridges that will carry the heavier traffic. The engineers work in shifts, under continuous stress, racing against time and German artillery. Pontoon bridges are assembled in water that flows cold and swift, the current tugging at floating sections, threatening to sweep them downstream if anchoring lines slip or if German ordnance severs the cables holding them in place. Trucks carrying pontoon sections rumble down roads, congested with infantry, armor, and supply vehicles, all competing for passage toward the river. When a section is damaged by artillery fire, engineers must repair it, while traffic backs up for kilometers. When a bridge comes under fire, covering troops must suppress the German positions while repair work continues, a coordination of infantry, tanks, and engineers working in concert under the pressure of shells falling nearby. The engineers are exhausted, knowing their work will be judged not by the perfection of the bridge, but by whether it holds under the weight of Third Army's momentum. If a pontoon bridge fails while tanks are crossing, the tanks are lost, the momentum is broken, and the entire operation falls behind schedule. This knowledge drives them to work faster, longer, with less rest, accepting risk because the alternative is failure at a scale that affects hundreds of thousands of men and the outcome of the entire campaign. Patton himself appears at the crossings, visiting engineers and assault troops, his presence a combination of encouragement and pressure. He understands intuitively that the pace of crossing determines the pace of the entire operation. A commander who accepts a slow, deliberate crossing across the Seine will see his entire army settle into a slow, deliberate tempo that can be exploited by German defenses and reserves. A commander who demands speed, accepts some risk, and pushes his engineers and assault troops beyond what they thought possible, maintains the momentum and the initiative that has defined Third Army's entire advance. He moves among the troops in his trademark riding outfit and polished boots, incongruous in the mud and confusion of a river crossing, his presence radiating confidence and expectation. Soldiers work harder when Patton is visible. Officers push their men to greater exertion when they see the commanding general at the river's edge, watching, assessing, expecting progress. This is partly theatre, but effective theatre in military command. The appearance of calm confidence from a senior commander affects the tempo and energy of work across an entire sector. The logistics challenge of supplying across the Seine becomes the invisible foundation that allows combat operations to continue. Fuel trucks must cross the pontoon bridges, carrying gasoline for tanks and trucks on the eastern bank. Ammunition trucks follow, their cargo too precious and too dangerous to risk on congested roads or uncertain bridges. Water trucks, kitchen trucks, medical supply trucks, the entire apparatus of sustaining 300,000 men must flow across the Seine while the bridges are still under German artillery fire and while combat operations continue on the far bank. The quartermasters orchestrate this flow with the precision of a symphony conducted under artillery fire. They calculate loads, prioritize movements, and adjust on the fly as divisions advance at different rates and encounter resistance that consumes ammunition faster than projected. If the logistics fail, the tactical advantage dissolves. A division that runs out of fuel cannot advance. An infantry company that runs out of ammunition cannot assault. Third Army's speed depends absolutely on supplies reaching forward units in quantities sufficient to sustain offensive operations. The engineers maintain the bridges. The combat troops assault across them. The logistical officers ensure that the supplies flow without interruption. By early September, the Seine crossings are complete, and multiple Third Army corps are operating on the eastern bank, fanning out toward Paris and beyond. The bridgeheads have expanded from narrow corridors secured by assault troops into broad areas of operations supporting entire divisions and corps. German resistance has been overcome or bypassed, and the river obstacle has been converted from a barrier into just another feature of terrain traversed in Third Army's relentless advance. The pontoon bridges, subject to enemy fire and carrying traffic far beyond their intended capacity, begin to deteriorate. Some are replaced by repaired permanent bridges as engineers restore damaged structures and establish new crossing points. The replacement becomes ongoing maintenance rather than emergency construction. By the time the last divisions of Third Army complete their crossing, the operation has already begun to blur in historical memory, a necessary technical feat that receives far less attention than the dramatic maneuver warfare before it, or the city liberation that follows. Yet without the engineers working under fire, without the coordination of multiple corps competing for limited crossing sites, without the logistics officers ensuring fuel and ammunition reached the eastern bank, Third Army's momentum would have halted at the river. The Seine crossing is not glamorous. It does not fit the narrative of bold generalship and rapid maneuver. But it is precisely this kind of grinding technical mastery, executed under pressure and against resistance, that separates successful campaigns from failures that collapse when confronted with obstacles. Patton grasps this, which is why he drives his engineers and logistics officers as relentlessly as he drives his combat troops. Speed is not achieved by willpower alone. It is the product of every element of an army functioning at peak efficiency. Every bridge built, every truck loaded, every supply line maintained, every soldier moving in synchronization toward the same objective. The crossing of the Seine represents a transition in Third Army's campaign. The race across Brittany and through the bocage of Normandy is behind them. The strategic exploitation into France and beyond is ahead. The Seine is the boundary between these phases, a moment where the army pauses, reorganizes, and prepares for the next phase of operations. On the western bank, the French soil of the occupied zone still bears the marks of German retreat: burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, hastily dug defensive positions that American forces breached and left behind. On the eastern bank, the landscape opens slightly, the terrain becomes more favorable for maneuver warfare, and the road toward Paris becomes clear. Patton's divisions are exhausted, their vehicles worn, their soldiers tired from weeks of continuous movement and combat. But the crossing of the Seine infuses new energy. The river is behind them. Germany is ahead. The war that seemed endless in the bocage now has visible markers and achievable objectives. Paris lies within reach. The Rhine, the final boundary before Germany itself, begins to appear as an attainable goal rather than a distant abstraction. Third Army emerges from the Seine crossing leaner, more efficient, and more confident. The engineers have proven they can build under fire. The assault troops have proven they can establish bridgeheads against resistance. The logistics apparatus has proven it can sustain operations across obstacles. And Patton has been proven correct in his fundamental belief that speed, aggression, and relentless momentum can overcome any defensive obstacle that the Germans can construct or improvise. The summer advance of 1944 could not be understood by looking only at maps, only at the forward positions of tanks and infantry pushing deeper into France. Behind every kilometre of ground gained lay something far less visible, far less celebrated, yet without it, Patton's army would have ground to a halt within days, stranded without fuel, without ammunition, without food. The machines of war consume resources at rates that modern observers struggle to comprehend. A single Sherman tank burned through fuel at a rate that would empty an entire fuel truck in less than 2 days of continuous operation. The Third Army, by the time of its Brittany breakthrough, fielded more than 1,400 tanks and countless thousands of trucks, jeeps, and support vehicles. Each one demanded gasoline. Each wounded soldier required medical supplies and evacuation. Each infantryman needed ammunition, food rations, and clean water. When Patton famously declared he would drive to the Rhine with such speed that German generals would not believe their intelligence reports, he was making a gamble not merely about tactics or enemy weakness. He was wagering that the vast, complex machinery of American logistics could sustain an army moving at speeds that conventional military doctrine said were impossible. The supply line that fed Third Army stretched like a taut rope from the Normandy beaches backward across hundreds of kilometers through conquered France to the point of origin. The chain began at the vast depots established in Normandy, where Liberty ships and cargo vessels unloaded tons of supplies daily. From there, trucks moved supplies inland to intermediate dumps, from which forward supply units drew what they needed and pushed it still further toward the moving front. The friction in this system was enormous. Roads remained partly destroyed by Allied bombing and German demolitions. Bridges needed replacement or repair. German stragglers and isolated pockets of resistance occasionally attacked supply convoys, forcing them to travel in armed groups. Weather could transform unpaved roads into impassable mud in hours. Yet the rate at which supplies moved forward had to accelerate to match Patton's acceleration, or the entire offensive would collapse like an overextended creature whose blood could not reach its extremities. The men responsible for this feat were quartermasters, supply officers, and transport company commanders, professionals whose expertise and physical stamina were every bit as vital to victory as any tank gunner's marksmanship, yet whose names were rarely recorded in after-action reports or history books. The challenge became most acute after the breakout from the bocage, when Third Army began its surge into Brittany and toward the Loire Valley in late July and early August. In the space of merely 10 days, spearheads of Third Army moved more than 150 kilometers forward. For comparison, the typical infantry division advance in World War II was measured as kilometers per week, not kilometers per day. The supply columns had to match this pace while operating through terrain where logistics infrastructure was primitive, where the enemy still held certain roads, and where the army was simultaneously consolidating territory and pushing forward new spearheads. Fuel consumption reached levels that planners had not truly anticipated. The endless movement of armored vehicles, the constant use of trucks for supply and transport, the employment of aircraft for close support, all demanded gasoline at a rate that threatened to exceed the capacity of the pipeline bringing it forward. Ammunition expenditure spiked during combat operations, and artillery barrages alone consumed thousands of rounds in a single day of intense fighting. Food supplies, while less glamorous than ammunition, could not be neglected. An army of more than 300,000 men requires more than 45,000 tons of supplies daily, calculated to include everything from field rations to coffee to replacement uniforms. No single supply convoy could deliver such tonnage. Instead, the system relied on a network of supply depots, supply lines, and transport companies working in concert according to strict schedules. Gasoline became the limiting factor, the commodity that threatened to choke off the entire offensive. In August, as Third Army's rapid advance deepened, fuel shortages became critical. The distances involved were immense. Supply trucks had to depart from depots in Normandy, drive more than 100 kilometers to forward supply points, unload fuel, and drive back, a round trip that exhausted vehicles and drivers. The truck itself consumed fuel to deliver fuel, creating a paradox where the energy cost of delivery began to approach the energy value of what was being delivered. Yet Patton's operational demands showed no willingness to acknowledge this constraint. Commanders in the field reported tank units running low on fuel, having to ration gasoline, forced to restrict movement to preserve what remained. At one point in early August, the entire advance was threatened by fuel shortages that forced actual operational decisions, where tanks could go, how fast they could move, which spearheads could be supported, to be driven not by Patton's desires or enemy weakness, but by the brutal mathematics of petroleum supply. Supply officers and quartermasters worked with logistics planners in rear areas to establish additional fuel dumps, to divert shipments from less active sectors, to squeeze every additional ton from the pipeline. Truck drivers operated on minimal rest, moving supplies forward continuously. Yet even with these efforts, the system operated at the edge of failure. The engineering of the supply system depended on transportation assets that were themselves vulnerable and finite. Trucks were the lifeblood of forward supply. American military trucks, 2.5-ton models, 6x6 vehicles, smaller trucks for specialized purposes, operated on roads that ranged from excellent to terrible. Maintenance became a constant battle. Vehicles broke down from mechanical failure, from damage, from simple wear and tear. Replacement parts had to be shipped forward from rear areas. Recovery vehicles had to extract broken-down trucks from supply routes. Truck drivers themselves became casual casualties, some killed by German ambushes, others simply exhausted to the point where traffic accidents became significant sources of loss. Yet despite these attritions, the truck transport system had to expand to match operational demands. Supply units requested more vehicles. Transportation officers worked to redirect trucks from less critical missions. At times, combat units were stripped of transportation assets to feed the forward supply effort. The ironies were profound. Tanks that had just captured German supplies sometimes had to wait for American fuel trucks to arrive before they could resume advance. Infantry units depended on trucks for ammunition resupply, but found themselves short of vehicles because those trucks were being used to transport fuel to armoured spearheads. Patton demanded more speed, more distance, more aggressiveness. Yet each of those demands increased the strain on a supply system that was already operating beyond its calculated capacity. Ammunition supply presented different challenges than fuel, but was equally vital. Artillery units consumed ammunition at staggering rates. A division of field artillery, with dozens of howitzers and guns, could expend hundreds of tons of ammunition in a single day of intense combat. Infantry divisions needed small arms ammunition, grenades, mines, and specialized ammunition for support weapons. Tank units needed armor-piercing rounds, high-explosive rounds, machine gun ammunition. Medical corps needed supplies of bandages, medications, blood plasma, and equipment. When the Falaise Pocket formed in mid-August, with tens of thousands of German soldiers trapped in a shrinking encirclement, American artillery poured thousands of rounds into the pocket daily, systematically destroying German forces that had nowhere to retreat. Ammunition trucks rushed forward continuously, yet supply officers reported cases where artillery units had to restrict fire rates simply because ammunition could not arrive fast enough to sustain maximum intensity. The logistical solution involved establishing more ammunition supply points closer to the front, rotating supply trucks more frequently, and occasionally stripping less active sectors of ammunition to feed the critical points of combat. Ammunition that traveled to Third Army often originated from depots in England or even the United States, had been loaded aboard transport ships, unloaded on the Normandy beaches, transported inland through multiple intermediate depots, and finally arrived at division and corps ammunition points. The chain was long, the risk of disruption was high, yet it functioned, barely, at the edge of capacity, sustained by the skill and determination of men whose job was to ensure that whatever was needed showed up on time. Food supply never became as spectacularly critical as fuel shortages, but it remained a constant challenge. American field rations, C rations, K rations, D rations were famous for being nutritious but monotonous. An army of 300,000 men required food at a rate that demanded dozens of supply trains daily. Fresh rations could not be supplied forward easily, so the diet of soldiers often consisted of canned rations supplemented with whatever local food could be requisitioned or purchased. Bread supplies were precious and competed with other cargo for truck space. Coffee, considered almost as essential as ammunition by American soldiers, had to be transported forward in quantity. Captured German supplies sometimes supplemented the ration system, preserved foods, livestock, grain, which provided both nutrition and eased the burden on American supply lines. Yet unlike fuel or ammunition, shortages of food rarely proved as operationally limiting. Soldiers could survive on reduced rations for days if necessary. Yet the maintenance of morale, the preservation of soldier health, and the prevention of disease all depended on nutrition. Supply officers balanced all these demands constantly. Water supplies in summer heat were critical. Medical supplies could not be neglected. Replacement uniforms, boots, and socks prevented disease and injury. The unsexy aspects of logistics were in truth among the most important guarantors of military effectiveness. The vulnerability of the supply system to enemy action remained constant. German forces, though retreating, were not entirely helpless. Isolated pockets of German soldiers left behind during rapid advances occasionally attacked supply convoys. German Air Force remnants, though increasingly rare, sometimes appeared to strafe truck columns. Partisans and German stay-behind forces harassed supply lines during the night. Supply convoys had to be armed and organized defensively. Armed guards riding in trucks, armed escort vehicles, and coordination with infantry units all provided protection, but also consumed resources and slowed movement. Damaged or destroyed supply trucks represented not merely the loss of the truck itself, but the loss of the cargo and the delay in reaching forward units. Supply lines had to be secured, which meant maintaining security along supply routes, establishing checkpoints, and sometimes fighting small engagements to keep key roads and bridges in American hands. The tactical situation thus constrained the supply situation, and vice versa. Could Patton advance faster in a particular direction? That depended on whether supply lines to that advance could be maintained. Could supply lines be extended further? That depended on whether combat units could secure the territory through which the supply lines ran. This interdependence between tactics and logistics was constant, often frustrating, and absolutely inescapable. The human cost of sustaining this supply system was rarely discussed but significant. Supply units suffered casualties from enemy action, from accidents, from disease. Truck drivers worked grueling hours, often through the night, with minimal rest. The stress of maintaining complex schedules while under fire and in the face of constant mechanical breakdowns created both physical and psychological strain. Support troops, mechanics, supply clerks, truck drivers, ammunition handlers saw less combat but were present in far greater numbers than the infantry. The casualty figures for Third Army include these men, though they are often overshadowed in historical narratives by accounts of dramatic tank battles or infantry assaults. Supply depots in Normandy, though located behind the main combat zone, were within range of German artillery and aircraft. Men working in those depots faced danger from bombardment or air attack. The entire logistics structure depended on people working in unglamorous, often dangerous roles, loading trucks, unloading cargo, maintaining vehicles, driving at night through hostile territory, calculating supplies, and making split-second decisions about resource allocation. These were the true heroes of the supply system, though history remembered them far less vividly than commanders or tank crews. By early September, the supply system began to reach the point where further rapid advances became genuinely impossible, not for any lack of enemy will to fight or any tactical failure, but because the logistics could not sustain faster movement. The distances from the Normandy depots had grown so vast that trucks spent more time in transit than in productive loading and unloading. The number of trucks available, while substantial, could not match the theoretical demands of a continuous, rapid offensive. Captured German supplies had become exhausted in many areas. The ability to establish new supply depots advanced only as fast as territory could be secured. Patton's frustration with the operational pause that followed was partly tactical disagreement with Eisenhower and Montgomery, but was equally rooted in a fundamental collision between what he wanted to do and what the logistics of the situation could sustain. Other commanders and strategists grasped this constraint more readily than Patton did. Yet the achievements of the supply system should not be diminished by its eventual insufficiency. Between June and September of 1944, the logistics machine that supported Third Army performed feats of supply and transportation that enabled the most rapid armoured advance of World War II. The system functioned at the very edge of its capacity, operated by men who improvised solutions, worked impossible hours, and maintained standards of supply that should have been impossible to achieve. Without that unglamorous, essential machinery of trucks and supply officers, Patton's tanks would have been immobilized, his infantry stranded, and his vision of rapid mobile warfare stillborn. The victory of Third Army was not merely the victory of aggressive commanders and skilled soldiers. It was equally the victory of quartermasters and truck drivers who moved mountains of supplies through conquered France to feed a war machine that consumed resources at rates that seemed to violate the laws of military logistics. That victory, less celebrated than tactical triumphs, was every bit as decisive. By the first week of September 1944, George Patton's Third Army had already rewritten the calculus of modern warfare. What had begun as a breakout from the Norman bocage had become something far more consequential, a proving ground for a new kind of American offensive, one based not on massive firepower concentrated on narrow fronts, but on speed, flexibility, and the audacious belief that an army could move faster than an enemy could organize a coherent defense. For nearly 2 months, this philosophy had held. German formations that should have been able to consolidate and counterattack had instead found themselves perpetually off balance, always retreating, always trying to establish a new line, only to discover American tanks already probing their flanks. But as September dawned, the character of warfare was beginning to shift. The Germans, for all their defeats and the catastrophic encirclement at Falaise, still possessed an army. They still possessed discipline. They still possessed the capacity to fight, and they were about to demonstrate it. The Meuse River, flowing northward through the Low Countries toward the sea, represented something more than simply another water obstacle. For the Wehrmacht High Command, it was a final chance to establish a coherent defensive line before American forces crossed into Belgium and began threatening the Rhineland itself. German commanders had already abandoned the dream of containing the American breakout in Normandy. What they could still hope to do was slow it, disrupt it, and eventually create circumstances where Patton's advance became unsustainable. The Meuse offered that possibility. It was wide enough to require crossing operations. It was defended by terrain suited to defense, and behind it lay German territory, ground that German commanders could fight for with renewed desperation because it was now German territory that faced invasion. This was no longer fighting to hold France. This was fighting to keep the war off German soil. The psychological difference was significant. German soldiers, many of them aware of the horrors their nation had perpetrated and fearful of retribution, fought with an intensity that had sometimes been lacking during the long French retreat. Patton's divisions approached the Meuse in the first days of September with characteristic momentum. The spearheads of his army, had already crossed into Belgium, and German resistance, which had stiffened considerably over the past few days, showed no signs of crumbling entirely. American armor tasked with forcing the Meuse crossing had to coordinate with infantry, engineers, and artillery in a rhythm that was considerably more complex than the lightning drives through open French countryside. The Meuse, unlike the smaller rivers that had been crossed during the summer campaign, was roughly 100 meters across in many places, with steep banks and strong current. Engineers had to construct pontoon bridges under fire or establish bridgeheads for amphibious vehicles, while German artillery from the far bank attempted to disrupt the operation. These were not the kind of battles that appeared in newspaper dispatches celebrating American prowess. They were instead grinding, technical, and often frustrating affairs, where progress measured in hundreds of meters might require hours of fighting and casualties that, while light by historical standards, seemed incongruous with the sense of inevitable victory that had characterized August. The Third Army's assault crossings began along a broad front, with multiple corps attempting to force the river simultaneously at different points. This was deliberate doctrine under Patton's command: compress time by compressing space, make it impossible for German defenders to concentrate their limited reserves by attacking everywhere at once. The 7th Corps, under Major General J. Lawton Collins, pushed toward the northeastern crossings near the town of Namur. The 12th Corps, under Major General Manton Eddy, thrust toward the central crossing points. The 20th Corps, under General Walton Walker, prepared to cross in the south near Toul. Each corps had to maintain contact with its neighbors while forcing an independent crossing operation, all while supplies grew increasingly thin and German counterattacks pressed against exposed flanks. The coordination required was formidable. One failure, one hesitation, and the entire operation could unravel into chaos. Yet Patton, watching from his command post and communicating through his staff with his corps commanders, kept driving them forward. No pauses, no regrouping, no allowances for fatigue or supply deficiencies. Just the next objective, then the one after that. German resistance during the Meuse crossings was fierce but disorganized. Wehrmacht forces in the area were exhausted, depleted, and stretched across too much frontage with insufficient reserves to mount coordinated counterattacks. What German units did exist fought well, particularly the Panzer Grenadiers and the remnants of SS divisions that still maintained cohesion, but they could slow the American advance without stopping it. Within 24 hours of the initial assault crossings, American forces had secured bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Meuse at multiple points. Within 48 hours, engineers had constructed pontoon bridges capable of sustaining the weight of tanks and trucks, and American armor began crossing to reinforce the infantry. German commanders threw in what reserves they possessed, limited counterattacks that achieved local success but could not restore their hold on the river. By the 5th of September, the Meuse crossing was secure. Patton had lost perhaps 2,000 men killed and wounded, a remarkable casualty rate for such a complex operation, a proof of the speed of the assault that had not allowed German defenders sufficient time to organize a truly devastating defense. With the Meuse behind them, Patton's divisions pushed deeper into Belgium. This was territory that had been liberated once before, in 1940, only to be conquered again and occupied for 4 years. The Belgian civilians who emerged from their homes to greet American tanks did so with the understanding that this liberation might prove permanent. American soldiers, many of them having never been outside the United States before 1944, moved through European villages with a mixture of curiosity and the weariness that came from nearly 3 months of continuous fighting. The weather, which had been favorable through August, began to deteriorate. The early September rains that would characterize late summer in northern Europe commenced, turning roads into mud and complicating supply operations that were already stretched to their absolute limit. Patton's logistics staff, functioning with extraordinary skill despite impossible circumstances, continued to move fuel, ammunition, and food forward. But the margins of supply had narrowed to dangerous levels. Trucks were breaking down from overuse. Drivers were exhausted. The remarkable supply line performance that had characterized August was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As Third Army advanced deeper into Belgium, German resistance began to stiffen in a more systematic way. The Wehrmacht was establishing new defensive positions along the Meuse and beyond, and German commanders were consolidating forces rather than allowing them to dissolve in continuous retreat. The spearheads of the American advance, probing toward the Moselle River and the German border itself, began to encounter German counterattacks that were far more organized and dangerous than anything encountered during the previous weeks. Panzer divisions that had been beaten piecemeal during the summer were now being consolidated behind new defensive lines. SS formations that had been scattered across France were regrouping. German artillery, which had often been deployed reactively during the retreat, was now being positioned deliberately and systematically. The character of warfare, fundamentally altered by the American offensive, was beginning to shift back towards something more recognizable to traditional military thinking. This was no longer a route. This was the beginning of a stabilized front. Patton drove his army forward into this hardening German resistance with the same intensity that had characterized the entire campaign. To the south, General Eddy's 12th Corps pushed toward the Moselle River, where Patton envisioned crossing and establishing a crossing point from which to launch operations into the Lorraine region. To the north, General Collins's 7th Corps drove toward the German border, attempting to circle north of German defensive positions and threaten them from behind. Each day saw reports of advances measured in dozens of kilometers in some sectors and only a handful in others, reflecting the increasing resistance and decreasing mobility as supply lines stretched beyond their sustainable capacity. German counterattacks, while not successful in restoring German initiative, were nevertheless creating casualties and slowing American momentum. The sense of invulnerability that had characterized Patton's army in August was giving way to a more cautious understanding that German forces, while defeated, were not broken. They were wounded, but not dying. Not yet. By the second week of September, American spearheads had pushed forward perhaps 200 kilometers since crossing the Meuse, but at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent. Supply lines were at the breaking point, fuel allocations were being rationed with increasing stringency, and German resistance was becoming increasingly coherent. Patton's divisions around Metz and along the Moselle were encountering German defensive positions that looked notably like what military intelligence had anticipated: fortified cities, prepared anti-tank positions, and German formations that appeared to have retained enough cohesion to conduct an organized defense. The weather continued to deteriorate. Logistics problems that had been manageable in August were becoming critical. Higher command, represented by Supreme Commander Eisenhower and his staff, was beginning to make strategic decisions about resource allocation that would affect Patton's ability to continue his offensive. The British advance in the north, under Field Marshal Montgomery, was also consuming supplies and fuel. Supplies that went north could not go to Patton. These were not merely logistical problems. They were strategic choices that would determine whether Patton could continue the offensive momentum or whether he would be forced to pause, consolidate, and wait for supply lines to catch up to his forward divisions. The Moselle River, running north to south through Lorraine and forming part of the barrier between France and Germany, represented both an opportunity and a barrier. Patton's initial crossing attempts, launching in mid-September, would be contested fiercely by German forces that understood the strategic significance of holding the Moselle. Unlike the Meuse crossing, which had been relatively brief and had given way to rapid exploitation, the Moselle crossing would be the beginning of a long, grinding campaign that would last through autumn and into winter. German forces defending the Moselle and the surrounding terrain were not the demoralized remnants of formations destroyed at Falaise. They were fresh formations, recently arrived in the area, positioned deliberately and equipped with the kind of fortified positions that required time and methodical warfare to overcome. The rapid maneuver warfare that had defined Patton's campaign was about to encounter something far more resistant, far more attritional, and far more costly. The opening phase of Third Army's extraordinary offensive, the phase of breakthrough and deep exploitation, was ending. The period of strategic stalemate was about to begin. The proving ground of German resistance and American logistics would become the new battlefield, and the character of warfare under Patton's command would be fundamentally transformed from the breakthrough tactics of summer into the attrition and siege mentality of autumn. Chapter 10. Narration. In early September 1944, George Patton stood at a crossroads. His Third Army had accomplished what few military minds thought possible: the rapid exploitation of a shattered German front, the encirclement of enemy forces, the liberation of France in a campaign measured not in months, but in weeks. Behind him stretched hundreds of kilometers of conquered territory. Before him lay the Rhine, the threshold to Germany itself, and the possibility of victory before winter settled across Europe. Yet now, at the moment when momentum seemed unstoppable, Patton found himself answering to men who saw the war differently, who questioned whether his relentless push toward the German heartland served the strategy that the Allies had collectively agreed upon. The intoxication of success was about to collide with the hard mathematics of military logistics and the competing visions of how this war should end. The fundamental disagreement that erupted in September between the Supreme Commander and his most senior subordinates had been building since the breakout from Normandy. Dwight Eisenhower, the American Supreme Commander, believed in a broad front strategy, a coordinated advance along the entire Western Front that would compress German forces from all directions and prevent them from concentrating their remaining strength at any single point. This approach reflected both American military doctrine and the political reality of the coalition. American forces would advance in the center and south, British and Canadian forces would press from the northwest, and French forces would clear the Mediterranean approaches. The strategy was methodical, comprehensive, and designed to minimize risks by distributing strength across multiple axes of advance. But it was also cautious, at least in the eyes of those who saw the window of German collapse opening before them. Bernard Law Montgomery, the British Field Marshal commanding British and Canadian forces in the north, had a different vision. Montgomery argued for what he called a single, concentrated thrust, a knife-pointed advance northeastward through Belgium and into the Rhine Valley that would cut off German forces, seize the great industrial regions of the Ruhr, and end the war in a matter of weeks. This strategy was audacious, economical in casualties, and it had the advantage of being Montgomery's strategy, which Montgomery believed meant it would succeed. Montgomery did not hide his conviction that American generalship, by which he meant the generalship of commanders like Patton, was wasteful and imprecise. In Montgomery's view, victory came not from aggressive exploitation but from careful planning, methodical preparation, and concentration of force. His northern thrust would require the bulk of available supplies, the lion's share of transport resources, and effective subordination of American forces to his command authority, something Eisenhower had resisted since the beginning of the campaign. Patton, watching this strategic debate unfold from his Third Army headquarters, found himself cast as an unexpected, almost accidental ally to Eisenhower's broad front approach, though for reasons that had nothing to do with military theory and everything to do with his own ambitions. Patton did not care whether the Allies followed a concentrated or dispersed strategy, as long as Third Army received the resources to advance rapidly toward the Rhine under his own command. He trusted neither Montgomery nor the elaborate coordination structures that Eisenhower tried to maintain between British and American forces. In Patton's view, the art of war lay in aggressive maneuver, in exploiting enemy weakness, in pushing forward relentlessly, even when logistics seemed strained and plans seemed to exceed available resources. He had spent years studying cavalry tactics and mechanized warfare, specifically because he believed that speed and audacity could overcome careful planning and resource limitation. Now, in September 1944, he saw an opportunity to prove his theories in the largest arena imaginable, and he wanted the fuel, the ammunition, and the transport to do it. The collision point came over a desperately limited resource: gasoline. After the rapid advances of August, American supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of French roads and through ports that could not yet deliver supplies fast enough to match the consumption of 300,000 soldiers and thousands of vehicles in constant motion. Every liter of fuel was precious. Eisenhower and his logistics staff performed the brutal mathematics. The American 12th Army Group could advance either broadly across a wide front, or it could concentrate resources on one thrust that would punch deep into Germany. Montgomery wanted the concentration on his northern thrust. Patton wanted resources for Third Army's drive toward the Saar and the Rhine. Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group and caught between the two, tried to support both. The result was that neither received quite enough to achieve the breakthrough they sought. In mid-September, Eisenhower made his strategic decision. The broad front strategy would continue, but with increased emphasis on Montgomery's northern thrust toward the Rhineland and the Ruhr. American forces would continue advancing in the center and south, but with resources shifted northward to support Montgomery's operation. For Patton, this was not merely a matter of strategic disagreement. It was a personal blow. His army, having just liberated France in what he saw as one of the great maneuvers of modern warfare, was being asked to slow its advance and live on rationed supplies, while Montgomery received priority for fuel and transport. Patton had little respect for Montgomery, whom he saw as cautious, publicity-conscious, and more interested in tactical perfection than in the fluid opportunities that mobile warfare created. In his diary, Patton raged against the decision, against the British influence on Eisenhower, and against what he saw as the squandering of an opportunity to end the war before winter. What Patton perhaps did not fully appreciate, or chose not to acknowledge, was that his own phenomenal success had created a genuine logistical crisis. Third Army had advanced so far and so fast that it had effectively outrun the ability of American supply systems to sustain it. Fuel consumption in a fast-moving mechanized army is staggering. Every kilometer traveled requires gasoline not just for combat vehicles, but for supply trucks carrying ammunition and food, for transport planes operating from airfields, sometimes hundreds of kilometers behind the front, for reserve stocks positioned for the next phase of operations. Patton's insistence on continuous forward movement had stretched American logistics to the breaking point. The choice facing Eisenhower and the Combined Logistics Command was not really whether to advance broadly or concentrate narrowly. The available supplies would not support either to full success. The choice was rather which objectives took priority and which subordinates received sufficient resources to keep advancing, while others consolidated and prepared for the next bound forward. The September pause was not Eisenhower's intention, but it became the result of his decision. With fuel rationed and supplies stretched thin, Third Army's forward momentum slowed dramatically in mid-September. What had been a race across France became a series of measured advances with longer pauses between movements. For Patton, the frustration was almost unbearable. In his mind, every day of pause allowed German forces to reorganize. Every kilometer not advanced meant additional American casualties when offensive operations resumed. He pushed his supply officers mercilessly for more fuel, more ammunition, more transport. He argued to Bradley, and through Bradley to Eisenhower, that Third Army should be given priority for resources. He suggested that if Montgomery's thrust was to be supported, it should be at the expense of the British and Canadians, not the American drive in the center and south. But the decision had been made, and Eisenhower, whatever his private reservations about Montgomery's strategy, would not overturn it in response to Patton's protests. During this September pause, German forces were doing exactly what Patton feared, reorganizing, consolidating, and preparing new defensive positions. The Wehrmacht had been shattered by the Normandy breakout and the subsequent rapid American advance, but the German army was far from destroyed. It had recovered from worse. German commanders, particularly in the higher reaches of command, understood that the window for strategic counteroffensive had closed, but the possibility of establishing a solid defensive line still existed. If the Allies would give German forces time, even a few weeks, to gather retreating units, consolidate divisions, and establish defensive positions along natural obstacles like the Moselle and Rhine rivers, the character of the war would change. It would become not a war of mobile maneuver, but a war of attrition, not the swift conclusion that Patton and even Montgomery envisioned, but a grinding struggle through the autumn and into the winter. The Moselle and Vosges mountains became the focus of German defensive preparations during the September pause. These were not artificial obstacles like the Normandy bocage, where hedgerows and narrow roads favored defenders. These were major geographic features: the Moselle River, flowing southward through fortified valleys, and the Vosges Mountains, ancient granite terrain that limited vehicle movement and forced armies to think in terms of slow, methodical advances rather than rapid exploitation. German engineers worked frantically to establish defensive positions, to create anti-tank obstacles, to prepare fallback positions that could be held long enough to allow the formation of a more cohesive defensive line. German forces arriving from the east, from areas no longer threatened, began to form reserve divisions that could be committed to crucial sectors. The German High Command, recognizing that they had lost the initiative but not the war, began thinking in terms of the winter line, a defensible position that could hold until spring and might even allow limited offensive operations if circumstances changed. Patton, observing all of this with the clarity that hindsight provides but with the frustration of contemporaneous uncertainty, recognized that the September pause was transforming the character of the campaign. The rapid maneuver warfare that had defined Third Army's success would be replaced by slower, more methodical operations. The grinding, attritional combat that now awaited would require not aggressive exploitation of fleeting opportunities, but patient accumulation of tactical victories. that might add up to strategic success. He did not welcome this prospect, but he also did not waste time in futile protest once the decision was made. Instead, he began preparing Third Army for a different kind of war, one in which the same aggression and forward momentum that had served so well in August would have to be expressed through relentless pressure against fixed positions, through coordination of artillery and infantry, through the slow, methodical reduction of German strength rather than the exploitation of German weakness. The strategic disagreement between Eisenhower and Montgomery, and the decision that came out of it, represented a fundamental moment in the Western campaign. It was the point at which the possibility of a rapid, mobile ending to the war, the kind of conclusion that cavalry officers like Patton dreamed of, gave way to the grim certainty of a slow push into Germany through the coming autumn and winter. The disagreement was not resolved by any convincing argument or clear demonstration of superior strategy. Rather, it was rendered academic by events. Montgomery's Great Northern Thrust, launched after weeks of careful preparation and with resources diverted from Patton's front, succeeded in capturing substantial territory in Belgium and the Netherlands, but failed to achieve the rapid breakthrough into the Ruhr that Montgomery had promised. German defences, given time to consolidate during the September pause, held at crucial points. American and British forces found themselves fighting for river crossings and defending against German counterattacks, not racing toward the Rhine as Montgomery had envisioned. Meanwhile, Third Army, operating with constrained resources and against increasingly organized German defenses, found that the rapid advances of August could not be repeated. The war ground on, and the strategic argument of September became, by November, an irrelevant debate about how a war already won had been conducted. The summer of 1944 belonged to George Patton. His armies had swept across France in a blur of motion, armor grinding forward under open sky, supply lines stretching impossibly but holding, German defenses crumbling against American audacity. By early September, the world seemed to bend to his will. But as autumn arrived, the landscape began to change. The terrain that had favored rapid maneuver warfare grew broken and defensive. The weather turned hostile, and the German army, battered and pushed nearly to collapse, dug in along a line they could actually hold. The war that had been one of movement and breakthrough became something far grimmer, a war of attrition, measured in incremental advances and mounting casualties, where speed was no longer possible and grinding persistence became the only currency that mattered. The obstacle was the Moselle River, that ancient French waterway that winds through the limestone hills of Lorraine like a scar through contested history. To reach Germany itself, Patton's armies had to cross it. The Germans knew this too. As summer faded into autumn, German commanders positioned their forces on the eastern bank with the precision born of desperation. They understood that if they could hold the Moselle, they could hold Germany. They fortified the high ground overlooking the river crossings. They positioned artillery and machine gun nests to command every approach. They mined the roads leading to the water's edge. The terrain itself became an ally to German defense. Lorraine is not flat country. It rises and falls in waves of hills thick with forest, cut through by river valleys that become natural strongholds. A defending army here could trade space for time, could force an attacker to grind forward meter by meter, bleed for every crossing, pay in lives for every kilometer gained. This was exactly the kind of warfare Patton hated most. Through September and into October, Third Army began its assault on the Moselle line. The initial crossings were not disasters, but they were not triumphs either. Engineering companies worked under fire to establish bridgeheads. Infantry divisions waded through the cold water or scrambled across hastily constructed pontoon bridges, only to find German defenders waiting on the far bank. Artillery barrages preceded every major assault, waves of American shells thundering into the German positions to soften them before the assault troops moved forward. But German artillery answered. German counterattacks came down the slopes of the hills surrounding the crossings. What should have been rapid maneuvers turned into grinding firefights. Units that had measured their advances in dozens of kilometers per day now measured them in hundreds of meters per week. Casualty lists grew longer, medical facilities filled with wounded. Ammunition expenditure soared, even as supplies grew scarcer and the weather grew worse. The weather became an enemy as terrible as any German division. September in Lorraine brought rain, October brought more rain and the first frosts. November descended into cold, mud, and the creeping approach of winter. The roads that Third Army's trucks depended on turned to morass. Supply convoys moved more slowly. Artillery pieces bogged down in mud. Fuel supplies, already stretched to their limit, became even more precarious. Soldiers dug into trenches that filled with water. They suffered from trench foot and exposure. The clear skies that had allowed American air power to dominate the summer campaign vanished behind clouds and fog. German aircraft could no longer be seen, but neither could American fighters support ground operations. The war became smaller, meaner, and reduced to immediate tactile reality. The cold seeping through uniforms, the mud covering boots and vehicles, the constant wet chill that exhaustion could not overcome, the knowledge that forward motion was now possible only through accumulated effort and increasing suffering. Yet Patton refused to acknowledge what the Moselle line represented, an end to the campaign of maneuver and the beginning of something else entirely. His personality, which had been forged in an earlier age of warfare, which had glorified cavalry charges and rapid thrusts, could not adapt to static siege warfare. He issued orders for more aggressive action. He drove his commanders forward, demanding results measured in objectives captured, not in the realities of defensive positions, bad weather, and supply shortages. He seemed to believe that sufficient willpower and aggression could overcome the material constraints of late 1944. His subordinates, the division and corps commanders who had to translate his orders into action on the ground, found themselves caught between Patton's insistence on aggressive maneuver and the brutal reality that maneuver was no longer possible. They had to find ways to push forward against an entrenched enemy in deteriorating conditions with resources that were never quite sufficient. They did so, but at tremendous cost. The crossing operations themselves became studies in methodical violence. American infantry would assault across the river in waves, establishing foothold positions on the eastern bank. German defenders would counterattack, sometimes succeeding in driving the Americans back, sometimes being repulsed with heavy casualties on both sides. Engineers would work frantically to repair or enlarge the bridgeheads, sometimes under active fire. Tank support would be brought across slowly, tanks bogged down in mud, and waiting for enough bridgehead to be secured to justify moving them forward. Artillery would continue to pound German positions, trying to suppress enemy fire, enough to allow infantry and vehicles to move. The tempo of warfare became one of violent rhythm rather than flowing motion. Attack, hold, consolidate, attack again. Each cycle cost lives. Each cycle gained kilometers, but very slowly. The momentum that had carried Patton's armies from Normandy to the Moselle evaporated into the mud and rain of Lorraine. By October, Third Army had managed to cross the Moselle at several points, but the crossing was incomplete and fragile. German forces still held significant portions of the east bank. The hills beyond the river, the high ground that made or broke any advance, remained largely in German hands. American attempts to drive eastward from the crossing points met fierce resistance from German forces fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland. These were not the same German forces that had collapsed under the weight of American breakthrough tactics in August. These were German soldiers who had regrouped, who had received reinforcements, who were now fighting on terrain they understood in positions they had prepared. The Wehrmacht had not been destroyed in the Falaise pocket. It had been wounded, surely, but it retained the capability to make American advance costly. The logistics of this grinding campaign became increasingly difficult. Supply lines that had been stretched across northern France and into Belgium now had to feed 300,000 men in a war of attrition where ammunition expenditure was constant and fuel consumption never decreased. The trucks that had carried supplies forward in the race across France now had to navigate mud roads and compete with combat operations for priority. Ammunition had to move forward constantly because the artillery barrages that Patton relied on to suppress German defences consumed tons of shells every day. Food had to feed men who were getting colder and hungrier as the weather turned. Medical supplies had to support an casualty rate that was steady and inexorable. The quartermasters and supply officers who had proven so brilliant in maintaining the momentum of summer operations were now being asked to sustain an army that was burning through resources faster than the system could deliver them. Shortages developed. The first serious fuel crisis emerged in October, forcing Patton to halt operations while supplies were gathered and pushed forward. For a general who worshipped movement and aggression, any halt was agony. November was the cruelest month. Rain and early snow fell on the hills of Lorraine. Temperatures dropped to just above freezing. The ground became harder to work with, but no easier to traverse. German resistance, if anything, became more fierce as Soviet forces advanced in the east and German commanders realized that the war was being lost. Desperate measures became routine. German counterattacks struck at American positions with increasing frequency, trying to keep American forces off balance, trying to prevent the establishment of momentum. American artillery responded with even heavier concentrations of fire. The casualty lists from both sides grew longer. American casualties, while still manageable compared to Soviet or German losses, were nonetheless steady and accumulating. Men were wounded and evacuated. Replacements arrived but were often inexperienced. Unit cohesion that had been forged through summer campaigns began to fray under the strain of constant combat and worsening conditions. Officers and sergeants tried to maintain discipline and unit effectiveness, but exhaustion was becoming as powerful an enemy as German artillery. Yet the objective was being achieved, if measured in the only way that mattered. German forces were being pushed back. The Moselle line was broken. American divisions crossed the river in increasing numbers. German forces, unable to concentrate sufficient strength to drive back the American crossing in its entirety, were forced to fall back toward new defensive positions. The high ground beyond the First River was captured through a combination of frontal assault and flanking maneuvers that used the broken terrain to overcome German advantages. Progress was measured in kilometers instead of the tens of kilometers that had characterized the summer campaign, but it was progress nonetheless. Territory was being gained. German forces were being killed, wounded, or captured. The Wehrmacht was being pushed slowly but inexorably toward Germany itself. It was the kind of success that does not appear in headlines and does not inspire troops with tales of breakthrough and rapid maneuver, but it was success nonetheless. By the end of November, Third Army had advanced from the Moselle to the Moselle Line and beyond, establishing positions in the hills of Lorraine east of the river. German forces had fallen back, creating new defensive lines. The campaign in Lorraine was not complete, but the immediate crisis had passed. The Moselle River was crossed. German forces were being pushed backward. American positions were being consolidated. The grinding logic of siege warfare and attrition was working, even if it was not dramatic. Patton, who had demanded constant aggressive action throughout this campaign, saw his demands being met, though the results looked nothing like the swift advances of summer. The victories of Lorraine were won through the aggregation of small successes, through the willingness of American soldiers and commanders to continue fighting in terrible conditions against an enemy that refused to surrender or break. This grinding, attritional campaign was the true test of Patton's army. The dramatic breakthroughs of summer had demonstrated what speed and aggressive maneuver could achieve. But the Moselle campaign demonstrated something equally important, that American forces could persist, could maintain offensive pressure, could continue advancing even when conditions were terrible, and progress was measured in increments rather than breakthroughs. The weather could not stop them. The supply shortages could not stop them. German resistance could not stop them. It was not the kind of warfare that produced legends or inspired newsreels back home. It was simply the grinding work of an army that understood that the war would be won by whoever was willing to continue fighting when conditions were worst. And on the Moselle, in the mud and rain and early snow of Lorraine, Third Army proved that it had the stamina, the discipline, and the determination to be that army. The rapid maneuver warfare of summer would return, but only after this essential transformation from an army of breakthrough and speed into an army of persistence and relentless forward pressure. The winter of 1944 had settled over Europe with merciless cold. Patton's Third Army, grinding through the Moselle campaign, had lost its momentum. The rapid advances of summer had given way to a slower, bloodier contest against entrenched German positions. Artillery batteries fired day after day into the frozen earth. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers. Snow fell on the command posts, and the tank parks, and the foxholes where American soldiers shivered through December nights. Patton, impatient as always, pushed his commanders for more aggressive action, but the mathematics of modern war had caught up with him. Terrain, weather, and German determination had slowed the great machine he had built. Yet he did not yet know that everything was about to change. He did not know that somewhere beyond the winter landscape, German commanders were preparing a gamble so bold, so desperate, so reckless, that it would transform Patton's predicament into his finest hour. On the 16th of December 1944, before dawn broke over the Ardennes, German artillery began to roar. For nearly an hour, the bombardment shattered the cold silence, opening the sky with fire and thunder. More than 1,600 German guns, a concentration not seen since the opening of Operation Barbarossa years before, poured shells onto American positions. The American soldiers in the thin front lines, mostly inexperienced divisions and stragglers, had no warning. No reconnaissance had detected the German buildup. No intelligence network had sounded the alarm. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise. When the guns fell silent, German armor and infantry surged forward through the darkness and snow. The 5th Panzerarmee under Hasso von Manteuffel, the 6th Panzerarmee under Sepp Dietrich, these were desperate German forces seeking one final victory, one last chance to snatch triumph from the jaws of certain defeat. Their objective: drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the American and British armies. It was madness born of desperation, yet it nearly worked. American lines crumbled under the assault. Entire regiments were surrounded and captured. The Germans poured through gaps in the front, their tanks rolling forward through snow-covered roads with the fury of men and machines that knew they were fighting for survival. The American First Army, under Omar Bradley, fractured under the weight of the offensive. Within hours, a massive bulge had formed in the American lines. What history would call the bulge, a salient that drove more than 40 kilometers into American-held territory. Rumors spread through the American rear. German paratroopers were landing behind the lines. German commandos dressed as American soldiers were infiltrating camps. German panzers were unstoppable, and American defenses were collapsing. Some of these rumors were false. Some had kernels of truth. But all of them created a sense of crisis that reverberated from the front lines to Supreme Headquarters itself. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, faced a moment that could define the entire war's outcome. A German breakthrough to Antwerp was not merely a military disaster. It threatened to drive a wedge between American and British forces and undermine the entire Allied coalition. At his headquarters in Verdun, where he maintained his command post in the shroud of the great fortress that had witnessed another brutal war, Patton received word of the German offensive. Unlike many commanders, he did not panic. Unlike many subordinates, he did not wait for orders. He had spent months thinking about war as a chess game played at tremendous speed, and his mind moved now with the clarity of a man who had been preparing his entire life for exactly this moment. The American First Army under Omar Bradley was in crisis, pushed back and fragmented. The American Third Army under Patton himself was positioned along the Moselle River to the south and east, hundreds of kilometers from the crisis point. But Patton's imagination moved faster than German tanks. He grasped immediately what needed to happen. Third Army must wheel 90 degrees to the north, abandoning the Moselle offensive, leaving behind only holding forces, and race toward the German salient from the south. Such a maneuver was not merely difficult, it was operationally complex on a scale that few armies in history had ever attempted. Yet Patton did not hesitate. Within hours of hearing the initial reports, Patton convened his corps commanders. He had already begun thinking through the logistics, the timing, the routes of advance. He knew the road net through Lorraine and Luxembourg. He knew the positions of his divisions and the capabilities of his transport. He knew which corps could move first and how fast they could travel. His chief of staff, Major General Hugh Gaffey, a meticulous planner who understood Patton's mind better than almost anyone, began coordinating the massive pivot. 3 corps, the 4th Corps under General Troy Middleton, the 12th Corps under General Manton Eddy, and the 20th Corps under General Walton Walker, would wheel northward on different routes. The Army's enormous supply train, stretched across hundreds of kilometers, would have to reorient itself without breaking. Ammunition dumps would need to shift positions. Medical facilities would need to establish new locations. Tens of thousands of vehicles would need to move on roads that winter had already claimed. It was like turning an ocean liner in a harbor while maintaining full speed. Patton himself could not sit in headquarters and coordinate from a distance. He climbed into his command vehicle, a Willys Jeep, and began moving forward, visiting division commanders, inspecting the movement of columns, pushing, urging, demanding that every man understand the urgency of the moment. He visited the units that would lead the movement north, the spearhead divisions that would have to cover the greatest distance at the fastest pace. He spoke to enlisted men and junior officers alike, his profanity legendary even in an army famous for soldiers' language, his intensity burning with the fever of a man who had waited years for this opportunity. Other generals might have spent days in planning and coordination. Patton coordinated while moving, adjusting routes in real time, making decisions on the fly, pushing subordinates who might have moved at a normal pace to move faster. His reputation for demanding the impossible had preceded him, and his subordinates, knowing his expectations, began to move accordingly. The word spread through the army. General Patton had a plan, and it involved speed. The movement began on the 17th of December, and it unfolded with an almost choreographed precision that defied the chaos of winter and the complexity of the logistics involved. The Fourth Corps moved north through Luxembourg toward Bastogne, where American paratroopers, the 101st Airborne Division, were surrounded by German forces. The 12th Corps wheeled north along different routes, establishing a front that would strike the German salient from the south and east. Behind these spearhead forces, an enormous network of support moved as well. Supply trucks, ammunition carriers, engineer units with bridging equipment, quartermaster companies with fuel and rations, medical units with ambulances and surgeons ready to establish field hospitals. The American military machine at its finest was moving into crisis with a speed that would have seemed impossible just days before. Roads, barely adequate in fair weather, now bore the weight of more than 500,000 men and all their equipment moving in winter conditions. Yet the columns moved, pushing through ice and snow, drivers fighting the roads, maintenance crews working around the clock to keep vehicles running. Eisenhower, facing the crisis, had made a crucial decision. Rather than allowing different armies to operate independently under the friction of competing objectives, he had placed Montgomery in overall command of the northern face of the salient and left Patton's Third Army under Bradley's command in the south. It was a decision that reflected the current military realities, yet it also meant that Patton's offensive against the German salient would be coordinated with, but not subordinate to, the British general. Patton did not complain about this arrangement in his diary or his conversations with his staff. Instead, he concentrated his fury and energy on the movement north, on the necessity of arriving at the crisis point before the Germans could consolidate their gains. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. The Germans had the advantage of interior lines and surprise, but they did not have unlimited time. If American forces could converge on the salient before German momentum was completely spent, the German offensive could be not merely halted but destroyed. The movement accelerated through the 18th and 19th of December. Patton received reports of progress from each corps. The Fourth Corps, moving on the most direct route to Bastogne, faced the heaviest German resistance as it pushed north toward the crisis. Units clashed with German columns also moving north. Bridges had to be seized before German engineers could blow them. Roads had to be cleared of enemy forces and obstacles. Yet the momentum continued. Patton's philosophy of aggressive, flexible warfare meant that units did not wait for perfect coordination. They attacked when they encountered the enemy. They seized opportunities when they appeared. They kept moving even when flanks were exposed or supply lines threatened. It was a style of warfare that could have been reckless in other circumstances. In this moment, facing a desperate German gamble, it was exactly what the moment demanded. Every hour that the Germans could not consolidate their positions was an hour that the American counteroffensive drew closer. By the 22nd of December, after 6 days of driving through winter conditions and German opposition, the leading spearhead of Patton's Fourth Corps broke through to Bastogne. The American paratroopers, who had been surrounded and fighting off German attacks for days, saw American tanks and infantry pour into the town. It was not merely a military achievement, it was a moment that vindicated Patton's entire approach to armoured warfare. The speed, the audacity, the refusal to accept that an army of 300,000 men could not pivot 90 degrees in the middle of a campaign and drive hundreds of kilometers in a week. All of it had worked. The relief of Bastogne would echo through American popular consciousness, through the historical record, through every account of the Second World War that followed. Soldiers would remember where they were when they heard Third Army had relieved Bastogne. The general commanding those forces would be remembered not as a controversial figure whose career had been threatened by earlier scandals, but as the commander who rose to a moment of crisis and moved with an audacity and speed that changed the course of the war. Yet Patton himself knew that the greater battle was just beginning. The relief of Bastogne was the opening blow, not the conclusion. Third Army would now push deeper into the German salient, attacking the German flanks and rear, driving them back and ultimately destroying the offensive that had begun 9 days before. The weather would remain brutal. The fighting would remain fierce. German forces would continue to resist with the desperation of men who understood that this was not merely a military crisis, but a strategic turning point in the war itself. Patton's next task would be not merely to hold the ground he had seized, but to methodically destroy the German forces in the salient and push them back toward their starting positions. It would be harder, bloodier, more grinding than the rapid movement of the first week. But he had already achieved something that his critics could never take away. He had moved with a speed and audacity that met a moment of supreme crisis with a response that matched the magnitude of the challenge. The Ardennes offensive, which Hitler and his commanders had launched with hopes of splitting the Allies and seizing Antwerp, had instead become the moment when Patton and his Third Army seized their ultimate vindication. The question of whether an officer so controversial, so profane, so psychologically unstable in the view of many of his contemporaries, could command the largest American army in the field had been answered. He could command it. He could move it with precision and speed. He could see opportunities where others saw only crises. And in the winter of 1944, in the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, Patton's army had proven that the aggressive, fast-moving tactics that defined his philosophy were not merely academic theory. They were the key to victory against an enemy that had already lost the strategic initiative and was now gambling everything on a final offensive thrust. The irony was complete. Patton's greatest vindication came not from a meticulously planned offensive that he had spent months preparing, but from a crisis he did not anticipate, met with a response that seemed to come from an instinctive understanding of what the moment demanded. Third Army was no longer the phantom force that had hidden in England while others invaded Normandy. It was the army that had liberated France, raced across Europe, and in its finest hour had turned a German offensive into the prelude to Germany's final defeat. The 16th of December 1944 begins like any other winter day on the front lines. Snow falls lightly across the Moselle Valley, where men of Third Army crouch in frozen trenches, waiting for movement orders that never come. This is the grinding monotony of the winter stalemate. Artillery exchanges, patrol actions, the slow erosion of supply lines stretched impossibly thin. None of them knows that hundreds of kilometers to the north, German panzers are breaking through American lines like water through a cracked dam. The Ardennes, a region of dense forest and rolling hills that American commanders dismissed as impassable in winter, has become the stage for the largest German offensive since the invasion of France. 2 panzer armies, operating under complete radio silence and extraordinary secrecy, have punched through First Army's thin defenses. The American lines are not collapsing, they are shattering. Tens of thousands of soldiers are falling back in confusion, equipment is being abandoned, and entire regiments are cut off and surrounded. By nightfall, as the magnitude of the German assault becomes clear, the strategic situation has transformed from stalemate into catastrophe. Patton receives word of the Ardennes breakthrough in the evening of the 16th, and his reaction is immediate and visceral. Where other commanders see disaster, Patton recognizes opportunity. The Germans have exposed their southern flank by driving northward into the Ardennes salient, a salient that Third Army, positioned precisely where it now stands, can strike from the side and collapse. While other officers debate responses and seek permission, Patton is already calculating. He turns to his chief of staff and declares that Third Army must wheel 90 degrees north within hours, abandon its positions along the Moselle, and race north to hit the German breakthrough from the south. It is an audacious maneuver, one that will leave the Moselle sector defended by minimal forces, while Third Army hurls itself northward into an uncertain situation. It is also precisely what Patton has trained for, what his entire philosophy of warfare demands. The man who has spent months chafing at the restrictions of winter stalemate now sees his moment. Third Army is about to execute one of the most dramatic redeployments in military history, a 90-degree turn in formation under combat conditions, over icy roads, across winter terrain, and into a crisis zone where the outcome of the entire European war hangs in balance. The logistical challenge is staggering. Third Army stretches across more than 300 kilometers of the Moselle sector, with supply lines running backward to the Normandy beaches and beyond. To wheel the army northward, entire corps must be extracted from their positions. Supply trains must be redirected. Ammunition and fuel must be rerouted to new locations, and the delicate balance of forces holding the line must be preserved with minimal troops left behind. Most commanders would spend days planning such an operation, circulating orders, seeking confirmation from higher command. Patton issues his orders orally, with characteristic brevity, and expects instantaneous compliance. The 12th Corps, commanded by Major General Manton S. Eddy, is closest to the breakthrough point and is ordered to disengage from the Moselle and drive north immediately. The I-4th Corps, under Major General Oliver P. Wood, will hold the Moselle sector with stretched thin forces while the bulk of Third Army wheels north. It is a gamble of extraordinary proportions. If German forces realize that the Moselle sector has been stripped of strength and attack westward, Third Army could be catastrophically divided. If Third Army's northward column is blocked or delayed, if roads become impassable, if supply cannot keep pace with the advance, then Third Army will be stranded in the frozen landscape between its old positions and its new objective. Yet Patton orders the movement with absolute confidence. He has studied war and logistics for decades, and he understands what others do not. Speed itself is a weapon. That audacity can sometimes accomplish what caution cannot, and that decisive action in a crisis often achieves results that defensive hesitation will never produce. The movement north begins on the 17th of December, even as the German offensive is still developing and the full scope of the crisis remains unclear. Columns of trucks, half-tracks, and tank transporters begin rolling northward through darkness and falling snow, following routes that intelligence officers are still mapping toward objectives that are being clarified hour by hour. The roads are narrow, icy, and crowded. German aircraft still dominate the battlefield, and any concentration of vehicles could be devastated by a coordinated attack. Men huddle in the back of freezing trucks, stamping their feet and beating their arms to maintain circulation. Officers navigate by compass and map in the darkness, relying on spot information and instinct. Yet the columns maintain movement, hour after hour, night and day, pushing northward as though drawn by some force larger than themselves. Division commanders report their locations and speeds to 3rd Army headquarters. Patton, rarely sleeping, tracks the movement from his command vehicle and pushes harder whenever reports suggest that units are falling behind schedule. The temperature drops below freezing, snow covers the roads, and men begin to show signs of exposure and frostbite. Yet the columns continue. Patton understands that time is more valuable than comfort, and every hour that 3rd Army can shorten its northward journey is an hour closer to striking the German salient from the south. By the 18th and 19th of December, 12th Corps has broken contact with the Moselle and is driving north in full column. The roads become more congested, more chaotic, as the Corps approaches the crisis zone. Refugees from the German breakthrough are streaming southward, clogging roads with ox carts, bicycles, and people on foot. Military traffic is streaming north. German aircraft make occasional appearances, attacking columns, forcing soldiers to scatter into the snow and ice before regrouping and continuing northward. The first elements of 12th Corps begin to engage German forces that have advanced south and west toward the flank of the breakthrough. Scattered battles in small towns and crossroads, nothing yet that threatens the Corps' northward advance, but sufficient to confirm that the German offensive has in fact achieved stunning initial success. American soldiers who have been retreating from the breakthrough are now encountering 3rd Army columns driving north, and stop to stare at the strange sight of vehicles heading toward the fighting instead of away from it. Some drivers ask for directions, others simply point northward and say the Germans are coming. Intelligence reports flow into Patton's headquarters with increasing urgency. The 1st Army commander is surrounded or cut off. Entire American divisions are encircled. The Germans have penetrated nearly 100 kilometers into American territory and are showing no sign of slowing. The magnitude of the catastrophe becomes clear, and with it, the proportional magnitude of what Patton's arrival with a fresh army can accomplish. Patton himself leaves his headquarters in an armored car and drives northward to see the situation firsthand. His method has always been to remain forward, to observe conditions directly, to command by personal presence rather than remote control. Staff officers urge caution. German forces are still operating in the region, and the commanding general is an obvious target. Patton dismisses their concerns and drives north anyway, moving through columns of his own troops, observing the conditions of roads and vehicles, watching soldiers' faces for signs of discipline or panic. He encounters refugees, captured German prisoners being moved to the rear, and American soldiers from other units who have been through combat in the breakthrough. He speaks to subordinate commanders, listening to their situation reports and offering encouragement. His presence generates a peculiar effect. Men see him, recognize him, and somehow understand that 3rd Army knows what it is doing, that events which seemed catastrophic moments before are now being contested by a fresh force with a clear mission. The confidence that Patton radiates seems to spread through the columns like electricity through copper wire. Men straighten their backs, drive more carefully, maintain discipline despite the chaos of the situation. By the 20th of December, the leading elements of 12th Corps have closed within striking distance of the German salient's southern flank. The German offensive, named Operation Autumn Mist by its planners, has achieved surprise and initial penetration, but has not achieved the speed necessary to accomplish its ultimate objective of reaching Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies. American 1st Army, under General Courtney Hodges, despite suffering catastrophic casualties and territory loss, has managed to establish defensive positions that slow the German advance. More critically, the arrival of 3rd Army from the south will hit the German forces at a moment when they are overextended, in the process of consolidating their gains, and vulnerable to the kind of flank attack that Patton is preparing. The encircled American paratroopers in Bastogne have held their positions against repeated German assaults, inflicting casualties and refusing to surrender despite being surrounded and cut off from resupply. Patton understands that relief of Bastogne has become not merely a military objective but a symbol. The relief of Bastogne will prove that the American army is not broken, that it retains the initiative, that the German offensive has failed in its ultimate purpose. He also understands that the faster Third Army reaches Bastogne, the fewer paratroopers will die, and the more German forces can be trapped between First Army pressing from the north and Third Army pressing from the south. On the 21st of December, elements of 12th Corps begin probing attacks against German positions that form the southern shoulder of the Ardennes salient. German forces, accustomed to American troops retreating before them, are taken by surprise by the sudden appearance of American armor and infantry attacking northward into their formations. The attacks are not massive coordinated assaults, but rather the leading divisions of 12th Corps pushing forward to break contact and establish themselves in assault positions. Fighting erupts in small towns and across snowy fields. German rearguard units, some of them shock troops and SS Panzergrenadiers, fight with desperation against opponents who are attacking rather than defending. American artillery, now beginning to flow north with the advancing corps, brings fire against German concentrations that the Air Force has identified from reconnaissance photographs. Supply convoys begin arriving at forward positions with ammunition and fuel that allows the advance to continue. Officers coordinate attacks through the night using maps and compass bearings, pushing men through darkness and snow toward objectives they have never seen. Radio communications crackle with reports of positions taken and defended, casualties suffered, and supply status. Patton tracks the advance on a map in his command vehicle, watching the leading units punch northward, calculating distances and time, pushing subordinates to move faster whenever reports suggest a slowdown. On the morning of the 22nd of December, the weather finally clears. Winter clouds that have blanketed the Ardennes for days break apart, revealing blue sky and weak winter sunlight. With the clearing weather comes air support. American fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force, grounded for days by bad weather, now begin launching strikes against German armor and transport columns. The advantage shifts suddenly and dramatically. German forces, which have been moving freely through the Ardennes under protection from the weather, are suddenly vulnerable to air attack. American bombers strike German fuel depots and supply columns. The German offensive, dependent on rapid advances to succeed, finds its pace slowing as losses mount and supply becomes more difficult. Meanwhile, the clearing weather also allows American reconnaissance to confirm the position of American paratroopers in Bastogne and the surrounding German forces. Intelligence officers provide Patton's commanders with accurate information about enemy positions, allowing coordinated attacks to be planned with better precision. And in the afternoon of the 22nd of December, spearheads of Third Army's 12th Corps push through the final German positions blocking the road to Bastogne. The breakthrough is not a dramatic cavalry charge, but rather a grinding series of small unit actions, as American tanks and infantry overcome German positions, push through roadblocks, and advance northward through snow-covered countryside. But it is breakthrough nonetheless. American soldiers, advancing northward through positions that German forces believed would hold them, suddenly find the road to Bastogne open. They encounter paratroopers moving south to make contact. Soldiers from different armies meeting on a frozen road in Belgium and, for a moment, embracing and celebrating the relief of the siege. German forces surrounding Bastogne, learning that their southern flank is now broken and that American relief forces have penetrated to the town, begin to disengage and regroup. The relief of Bastogne is not a dramatic rescue but rather a tactical breakthrough that shatters the encirclement and establishes Third Army as a commanding force in the Battle of the Bulge. Patton, learning of the breakthrough, records in his diary that Third Army has accomplished in 36 hours what was thought to require weeks of careful planning. The maneuver, the wheeling of an entire army 90 degrees from a static position, the northward advance across frozen terrain, the penetration of German positions, and the relief of encircled American forces, has been executed with a speed and coordination that sets the standard for mobile warfare. The cost of the advance is substantial. Third Army suffers more than 3,000 casualties in the northward drive, men frozen to death in the backs of trucks, soldiers killed in the fighting in the Ardennes, vehicles lost to German air attack and anti-tank fire. Supply lines that had been stretched thin along the Moselle are now stretched impossibly thin over distances that have doubled. Officers report shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food as the advance accelerates. Yet the momentum is maintained. Third Army, by driving north when other units were being pushed north, has seized the initiative from the Germans and begun the process that will eventually collapse the Ardennes offensive and restore the strategic situation to Allied advantage. The breakthrough to Bastogne is a moment of vindication for Patton's philosophy of warfare, that speed, audacity, and aggressive action can accomplish things that caution and careful preparation cannot. The paratroopers who have been surrounded for days see the approach of Third Army armor and understand that American forces remain capable of decisive offensive action even in the midst of what has appeared to be a catastrophic defeat. And Patton, watching the advance from his command vehicle, knows that his moment has come, that the murmuring critics who questioned whether an old cavalry officer could command a modern army have fallen silent before the evidence of what has been accomplished in the snow of the Ardennes. The breakthrough at Bastogne on the 22nd of December was not an ending. It was a beginning of a different kind of war. As American paratroopers of the 101 Airborne Division emerged from their foxholes to greet the spearhead of Third Army's 4th Corps, neither soldiers nor commanders fully grasped what lay ahead. The German Ardennes offensive, Operation Autumn Mist, had collapsed into strategic failure, but the German armies that had launched it were not destroyed. They were wounded, yes, fractured and reeling, but they still possessed armor, still commanded thousands of guns, and still fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew their homeland was being invaded from both east and west. For George Patton, this moment marked a fundamental shift in how he would wage war. The lightning advances of summer, the sweeping maneuvers that had carried his army across the Seine and toward the Rhine, now gave way to something grimmer and more methodical. He would still push forward, still demand speed and aggressiveness from his commanders, but the enemy had learned to give ground in controlled fashion, to establish new defensive lines, and to trade space for time. The kind of breakthrough that had characterized the Normandy breakout, where German forces simply collapsed and fled eastward, would not come again. The terrain itself conspired against rapid maneuver. The Ardennes region in Belgium and Luxembourg, which had seemed relatively open during the German offensive, revealed itself to be a world of narrow roads, dense forests, and scattered villages that could be held by small, determined garrisons. As Third Army's divisions pushed north and east from Bastogne, in the days immediately following the breakthrough, they found themselves funneling through choke points, navigating icy roads where a single destroyed bridge or overturned truck could stall an entire corps. The weather was abysmal. Snow fell relentlessly, turning roads to slush during brief warm periods and freezing them into treacherous sheets at night. Visibility was measured in meters, which meant air support, the great advantage that had enabled Patton's summer advances, was often impossible. Tank crews suffered from frostbite nearly as much as from enemy fire. Soldiers huddled in frozen forests, many of them wearing summer uniforms that had been hastily supplemented with whatever winter clothing could be scrounged. The logistics of moving an army through such conditions stretched the supply system to near breaking point. Trucks skidded off icy roads. Ammunition had to be carefully rationed. Fuel, always the limiting factor in Patton's operations, became even more precious when movement itself became so difficult and dangerous. Yet forward momentum was maintained. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Third Army's performance in late December 1944 and throughout January 1945. Other American formations, caught off guard by the German offensive, had fallen back in disorder or fought static defensive battles. Third Army had wheeled 90 degrees and attacked into an ongoing crisis without hesitation, and now it continued to push deeper into the German salient even as conditions worsened. Patton himself drove constantly in his command vehicle, visiting division and corps headquarters, pushing his subordinates to maintain offensive action. He was 70 years old in an era when men in their 50s were considered elderly by the standards of intense combat. Yet he seemed to draw energy from the crisis, seeing in it the validation of everything he had argued about the need for aggressive leadership and the importance of keeping enemies off balance. Third Army's divisions advanced in 3 parallel efforts, one driving northeast toward Germany through the Ardennes Plateau, another pushing east toward the Moselle River, where recent fighting had stalled, and a third containing German forces south of Bastogne that might otherwise have attempted a renewed offensive. It was a complex coordination of effort that required constant communication, flexible orders, and the willingness to shift resources toward wherever German resistance was thinnest. Patton's command style, which had seemed reckless in summer 1944 when rapid maneuver carried all before it, now revealed itself to have been training for this kind of complex, multi-front operation. The fighting itself took on different characteristics. In summer, German forces had been trying to consolidate new positions against American pursuit. Now they fought to keep their armies intact, to preserve formations that could retreat in good order and establish new defensive lines. The result was warfare that resembled the grinding battles of the First World War, far more than the mobile campaigns that had characterized summer 1944. German Panzer Grenadier divisions and SS formations, combined with Wehrmacht infantry that still fought with considerable skill, established successive defensive positions in forests and villages. They would hold long enough to inflict casualties on attacking American forces, then withdraw to the next prepared position under covering fire from artillery and tank destroyers. American losses mounted steadily. By the end of December, Third Army had suffered more than 4,500 casualties since the start of the Ardennes crisis. By the middle of January, that number had doubled. By the end of January, when Third Army finally secured the entire line of the Moselle River and consolidated its gains, it had sustained more than 15,000 casualties while inflicting perhaps double that number on German forces. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal in their logic. Victory goes to whichever side can absorb losses and still maintain the will and ability to advance. Third Army had both. The German forces, by contrast, were beginning to feel the accumulating weight of losses that could not be replaced. Their tank forces, which had opened the Ardennes offensive with more than 2,000 tanks and assault guns, were being ground down by continuous combat against American armor that possessed numerical superiority and operated from an increasingly secure logistical base. When German tanks were destroyed, replacements came slowly, if at all. When German crews were killed or wounded, replacements were often barely trained and recruited from rear area support troops. The replacement system that had functioned adequately for the Wehrmacht in 1943 and early 1944 had completely broken down by late 1944. Older soldiers were pressed back into line units. Young boys from Hitler Youth formations were being drafted into front-line divisions. Officers and NCOs were being killed faster than they could be trained and promoted. The German army that Patton's Third Army faced in January 1945 was a force still capable of inflicting serious damage, but it was not a force that could be rebuilt. Every German tank destroyed, every German soldier killed or captured, represented a permanent reduction in German fighting strength. Patton understood this with the clarity that comes from simple mathematics and the study of military history. He was determined that Third Army would apply this pressure relentlessly, would not pause to allow German forces to consolidate, would press forward regardless of cost until German armies were ground into destruction. The methodical nature of Third Army's advance through the Ardennes salient was not, therefore, a failure to achieve the breakthrough that Patton desired. It was the application of a different operational philosophy suited to the circumstances at hand. In summer 1944, German forces had been caught unprepared, displaced from prepared positions, and forced to fight while moving. The result was German collapse. In January 1945, German forces had time to prepare positions, could move to defensive terrain, and fought from positions they chose. The result was a slower, grinding campaign of attrition. But Patton grasped that this kind of grinding campaign was exactly what would collapse German armies in the long run. Continuous pressure, the refusal to allow consolidated defense, the use of superior artillery to destroy enemy positions before assaulting them, these were the methods of destruction. And destruction was the goal. The symbolic moment that captured the nature of Third Army's campaign in January came not from a dramatic breakthrough, but from a simple mathematical fact. On the 20th of January, after roughly 4 weeks of continuous advance, Third Army's spearheads reached the original German starting positions for Operation Autumn Mist, the line from which the Germans had launched their offensive in mid-December. The bulge in the front, the salient that had threatened to split the American army and capture Antwerp, was now entirely eliminated. German forces had been pushed back not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through continuous grinding pressure applied day after day, in snow and cold, against prepared defensive positions. It was not the kind of victory that war correspondents wrote about with enthusiasm. It was not the kind of campaign that would fill history books with tales of audacity and daring, but it was the kind of campaign that wins wars. German armies that continued to retreat, that lost soldiers and equipment without replacement, that saw their strategic gamble turn into catastrophic failure, such armies eventually ceased to exist as fighting forces. As Third Army consolidated its position along the line it had held before the German offensive, Patton turned his attention to preparing for the next phase of the war. The Ardennes offensive, launched by Hitler himself, had been intended as a final desperate gamble to split the Western Allies and seize Antwerp, forcing the United States and Britain to negotiate a separate peace with Germany while Soviet armies advanced from the east. It had failed, but Hitler could not accept that failure, and Germany still possessed armies, still commanded resources, and still fought with the fanaticism that ideology and fear instilled. The campaigns of spring 1945 would require Third Army to advance even further, to cross the Rhine, to penetrate deep into Germany, and finally to drive toward the Alps and the last redoubt where Nazi leaders might attempt to make their final stand. Patton, vindicated in his prophecy that aggressive armoured warfare could overcome any German defence, was now ready for that next phase. Third Army had proven itself not just as an army of manoeuvre, but as an army that could grind down German forces through relentless, methodical pressure. The days of lightning advances were coming, but they would come only after German armies had been worn down through the kind of grinding warfare that Third Army had just mastered in the Ardennes and Lorraine. Patton had adapted his methods to match his circumstances. That adaptation, more than any single breakthrough, was perhaps the truest measure of his military genius. In the winter darkness of 1945, the Third Army stood exhausted. The Ardennes crisis had consumed December and January, pulling men and machines through a winter counteroffensive that was necessary but grinding, a war of attrition fought in snow and mud against desperate German defenders. By the time February arrived, Patton's divisions had stabilized their positions, absorbed reinforcements, and begun to regroup. Yet something had shifted in the strategic landscape. The German Wehrmacht, stretched across a collapsing front with Soviet forces pressing from the east and American and British armies hemming from the west, was no longer capable of major offensive operations. It was dying. The question was not whether Germany would lose, but how quickly the Third Army could advance toward the final victory that everyone now sensed was within reach. Patton, given a choice between continued grinding attrition along the Moselle or a resumption of the rapid maneuver warfare he preferred, chose motion. By early February, orders came down through the chain of command to begin a new offensive eastward. The final push toward the Rhine was about to begin. The German defensive structure in the winter of 1945 bore no resemblance to the organized, layered defenses of previous years. The Wehrmacht had been bled white through 3 years of defensive operations on the Western Front, compounded by the catastrophic losses at Falaise, the grinding winter battles, and the constant pressure of American and British offensives that never granted breathing room. Replacements were scarce, training was minimal, and morale among regular Wehrmacht soldiers was collapsing as everyone understood that Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was measuring its remaining life in weeks. Behind the fractured front line, German industry was in ruins. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced German tank production to a trickle, and ammunition stockpiles were shrinking visibly. The Luftwaffe barely existed anymore as an effective air force, reduced to sporadic fighter sweeps that accomplished little except to die trying. What remained of German strength was concentrated in pockets, elite SS formations hardened by years of combat, desperate Hitler Youth conscripts indoctrinated into suicidal loyalty, and scattered Wehrmacht officers who still believed in some form of orderly defense. These fragments would oppose the Third Army's advance, but they could not stop it. They could only slow it and make it bloody. Patton's divisions were lean and experienced by this point in the war. The men who had survived from Normandy through the winter campaigns had learned their business through hard application. Sergeants knew how to move infantry through rubble-filled towns. Tank commanders understood how to read terrain and exploit weakness. Logistics personnel had worked out systems for sustaining rapid advances through hostile territory. The Third Army in February 1945 was not the uncertain force that had emerged from Normandy in August 1944. It was professional, confident, and hungry for the end of the war. New equipment flowed in steadily, replacements for worn-out vehicles, fresh ammunition, and fuel in quantities that had been scarce just months earlier. The supply situation had improved dramatically since the autumn, when stretching lines had constrained operations. Now the Quartermaster Corps could support the kind of rapid, far-ranging maneuvers that Patton demanded, though coordination remained complex and mistakes remained possible. Patton spent February preparing his army for the assault, visiting divisions, speaking to officers and men, reminding them that Germany lay just ahead and that the Rhine, the last major water barrier before German defeat, was within striking distance. Speed, he repeated endlessly, was the key. Move fast, move continuously, drive deep into German territory before German forces could establish coherent defenses. The offensive began in early February, with Third Army pushing eastward against crumbling German positions. The Wehrmacht divisions opposing Patton tried to establish defensive lines, to create some form of coherent front, but the speed of American advance and the constant threat of encirclement made sustained defense impossible. German commanders would establish a position only to find that American forces had flanked it or that reserves were unavailable to reinforce it. Whole German regiments surrendered rather than fight to the last man, the will to resist shattered by the knowledge that defeat was inevitable. Small unit actions erupted constantly as American spearheads probed and pressed, but these were skirmishes on the periphery of a larger collapse rather than major battles. The Third Army's engineers worked constantly to repair roads, bridge streams, and clear pathways for the advancing columns. Combat troops moved through small towns and villages in rapid succession, each advance measured in tens of kilometers rather than the single kilometers of the autumn and winter. The German Luftwaffe attempted occasional interference, but these were token gestures. American air superiority was so overwhelming that German pilots could achieve little except to die. The Third Army's progress accelerated through the month of February, and by early March, the division commanders reported that they were pushing into German territory that had never seen combat before. Pockets of intense German resistance appeared unpredictably, and these fights were often the bloodiest of the campaign. SS formations, understanding that their ideology and crimes made surrender unlikely to be merciful, fought with desperate ferocity. Around the city of Trier, German defenders held the Moselle crossings and inflicted significant casualties on American assault forces before being overwhelmed. Around Cologne and other Rhineland cities, Hitler Youth fanatics threw themselves against American tanks and infantry in suicidal counterattacks that accomplished nothing except to raise American casualty figures slightly. Patton had no patience for these pockets. Where resistance was light, he pushed forces through rapidly. Where resistance was heavy, he ordered divisions to bypass the strongpoints, leaving them to be reduced by follow-up forces while the main effort continued eastward. This strategy meant that some areas had to be fought twice over, but it kept the momentum of the advance unbroken. Artillery barrages preceded major operations, pounding German positions into submission before infantry assaults cleared the rubble. Tank columns advanced with infantry accompanying them, moving tactically but also moving fast, keeping pressure on German defenders constantly so they never had the chance to dig in effectively or coordinate counterattacks. By mid-March, the first elements of Third Army reached the Rhine River. The Rhine at this point in the river's course flows northward through Germany, its width varying from perhaps 150 to 300 meters depending on the location. It was formidable enough to constitute a serious obstacle, though not as massive as it appeared in the imagination of those who had never crossed a major river under fire. On the western bank, Patton's army was concentrated and ready. On the eastern bank, German defenders were sparse, disorganized, and demoralized. The contrast was stark. The Third Army could concentrate overwhelming force wherever it chose to cross. German forces were scattered, stretched thin, and lacking the reserves to contest every crossing point. German commanders understood that the Rhine could not be held as a continuous barrier. The best they could hope for was to delay the American crossing by a few hours or days, and to inflict casualties that would reduce American combat strength. They could not stop the crossing. Everyone understood that. The question was merely whether they could make it expensive. The terrain around the Rhine crossing zones was mixed. In some areas, open ground provided clear approaches to the river. In others, forests and towns provided cover for German defensive positions. The German defenses were strongest in the north, where the Rhine was widest, and where German commanders had concentrated their limited reserves. In the south, around Oppenheim, and in the area that Patton had chosen for his main crossing effort, German defenses were thinner and more scattered. Patton had studied the map carefully, consulted with his engineers, and examined reconnaissance reports from his spearhead divisions. His decision was characteristically aggressive and characteristically himself. He would cross at multiple points simultaneously, spreading German defenders thin and creating multiple bridgeheads from which to pour forces into Germany. Where the Germans had expected American forces to cross at obvious, heavily defended points, Patton's divisions would appear at unexpected locations with engineers ready to construct bridges and infantry ready to establish foothold positions on the far bank. This meant that German forces, already stretched taut, would have to react to American crossings at multiple locations, unable to concentrate reserves effectively because they did not know which crossings would be the main effort. In late March, as the weather cleared and roads dried enough to support rapid movement, Patton gave the final orders for the Rhine crossing. Division commanders prepared their assault troops. Engineers stockpiled bridging materials and assault boats, moving supplies forward in the darkness to avoid German air attack and artillery observation. Support units positioned themselves to follow up once the initial crossings were successful. The Third Army had not crossed a major river since the Seine in August and September of 1944. The engineering challenges were substantial, but they were not insurmountable. American engineering units had become expert at river crossing operations. They understood pontoon bridge construction, they had practiced under fire, and they had experienced commanders who could coordinate the movement of thousands of men and vehicles across a major water obstacle in the face of enemy opposition. Patton himself was in motion constantly, visiting forward division commanders, checking on assault preparations, reminding everyone that speed was still the essential ingredient. German defensive fire would be sporadic and ineffective, he said. Get across, get established on the far bank, and push east before German reserves could concentrate. The war in Europe was entering its final act. Third Army would play the lead role in that act if Patton had anything to say about it. The soldiers of Third Army who would conduct the actual Rhine crossing were tired. Most had been in continuous operations since August of 1944, with only the winter pause providing anything approaching a rest. Men had been killed and wounded, rotated home, replaced by new arrivals, and hardened by experience. Their uniforms were worn, their vehicles were weathered, their weapons were familiar instruments, used so many times that the actions of loading and firing were reflexive, performed without conscious thought. Yet something had changed in their attitude since the winter. In December and January, when the German Ardennes offensive had caught American forces unprepared and pushed them back, there had been uncertainty. The war was supposed to be ending. How could Germany still have strength for a major offensive? But the counter-offensive had worked. Third Army had wheeled north, relieved Bastogne, and proven that German strength was an illusion, an exhausting spasm from a dying enemy. Now, in March, everyone understood that Germany was finished. The only question was whether Germany would surrender before every town had been fought for and every bridge had been destroyed. The men of Third Army wanted the war to end, but they wanted it to end quickly, with them still alive, still able to go home. This desire for speed, for ending the war before another winter came, infused the operation. The Rhine crossing was not just a military maneuver, it was the beginning of the end. The crossing itself, when it came in the pre-dawn darkness of late March, was almost anticlimactic. American artillery barrages pounded German positions, and then assault boats loaded with infantry pushed out into the dark water. German defensive fire came, sporadic and ineffective, insufficient to stop the American advance. Engineers worked through the night establishing pontoon bridges, while combat troops established foothold positions on the far bank. Some German counterattacks came, desperate attempts by local commanders to drive the Americans back into the Rhine, but these attacks were crushed immediately by American artillery and supporting armor. Within hours, multiple bridges were operational, and American tanks were pouring across the Rhine in seemingly endless columns. German defensive lines, already fractured and thin, collapsed completely under the weight of American numbers and firepower. The Third Army had crossed the Rhine. The final barrier had been breached. Germany's heartland lay ahead, and Third Army, moving again with the speed and confidence that had characterized its best operations, was ready to pour into it. By the end of March, multiple divisions of Third Army had established bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Rhine and were beginning the rapid advance through German territory that would characterize the final weeks of the war. The speed of movement astonished even the veterans who had experienced the summer breakout from Normandy. German forces were collapsing so rapidly that American divisions were advancing 50 kilometers in a single day, encountering German prisoners surrendering in groups, finding German vehicles abandoned along roads, and watching German soldiers simply walk away from their units rather than continue a hopeless fight. The German civilian population was emerging from bunkers and cellars, uncertain whether to resist or surrender, but ultimately choosing surrender as the only rational response to American military power. American soldiers, tired of fighting and eager for the war to end, were sometimes gentle with German prisoners and civilians, sometimes harsh, reflecting the strain of continuous combat and the knowledge that friends had been killed by German hands. Yet the momentum never slowed. Patton was everywhere in these final weeks, checking maps, consulting with division commanders, pushing always eastward. The Rhine had been crossed. The war was ending. Third Army would race to the conclusion. As March turned into April, the Third Army's advance carried it deeper into the interior of Germany, toward the objectives that Eisenhower had assigned for the final destruction of German military power. The Wehrmacht was no longer capable of organized resistance. What remained was chaos. German units dissolving, commands breaking down, soldiers surrendering or deserting in vast numbers. German leadership was fractured, with some commanders wanting to negotiate surrender terms and others wanting to fight to the last man in a fantasy of redemption that could never be achieved. The Third Army raced past all this confusion, adding to the chaos through the speed and force of its advance. Bridges were captured intact, towns surrendered without fighting, and roads that Third Army divisions moved over became corridors of advance that German forces could not contest. The final push to the Rhine had resumed the rhythm of mobile warfare that had defined the Third Army's greatest successes. In the weeks to come, as April progressed and German resistance crumbled into nothingness, the full scope of this final advance would become clear. But in late March, the Rhine crossed, and German territory falling behind American spearheads, the men of Third Army could sense that the end was truly approaching. The war they had fought for 9 months across France and into Germany was approaching its conclusion. The price had been high. Tens of thousands of casualties, friends lost, trauma that would never fully heal. But victory, which had seemed uncertain in September, then impossible in December, was now assured. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years would not last another month. By the winter of 1945, the Rhine River had become more than a physical barrier. It was the wall that separated the Allied armies from Germany itself, the final major natural obstacle between American forces and the complete collapse of Nazi power. For weeks, Third Army had been pushing eastward across the German countryside, grinding through winter mud and deteriorating German resistance. But the Rhine remained, vast, cold, and defended by whatever German forces could still mount a coherent defense. The river was between 600 and 1,000 feet wide depending on the location, with steep banks that favored the defender and currents swift enough to carry away pontoon bridges if German engineers managed to destroy them before crossing could begin. Every military commander knew that crossing the Rhine would be a major operation, requiring careful preparation, massive coordination, and the kind of methodical assembly that normally took weeks to arrange. But Patton had never been a commander who believed in methodical assembly. He believed in speed, surprise, and the willingness to accept calculated risk. In early March, as Third Army completed its bloody consolidation of the Ardennes salient and its final grinding advance across the winter landscape, Patton began studying the Rhine crossings available to his army. To the north, British Field Marshal Montgomery was preparing an elaborate crossing operation near Wesel, a massive, carefully orchestrated assault with massive quantities of engineering support, airborne divisions standing by, and all the accumulated weight of meticulous British planning. The operation was being built to be perfect, which meant it would be methodical, which meant it would take time. Montgomery's crossing would be the main effort, the official crossing that would capture the headlines and the historical record. Patton studied Montgomery's plans and smiled because he saw an opportunity that most generals would have missed. If Montgomery was preparing the main effort to the north, then German defenders would be concentrating their attention there, reinforcing that sector, preparing their response to what they believed would be the decisive crossing, which meant that somewhere along the Rhine there might be a place where the Germans were not quite as prepared, not quite as vigilant, where a commander willing to move fast and strike with minimal warning might achieve something remarkable. The location Patton selected was near the small German town of Oppenheim, roughly 50 kilometers south of the Wesel crossing zone. Oppenheim sat on the eastern bank of the Rhine, at a point where the river narrowed slightly and where American reconnaissance had detected only light German defensive positions. The terrain on the western bank featured gentle slopes that would allow tanks and vehicles to move toward the water without too much difficulty, and across the river, the eastern bank seemed to offer promising ground for an assault force to consolidate. More importantly, Oppenheim was not where the Germans expected the main American crossing to occur. German commanders had already begun withdrawing forces from that sector to reinforce the Wesel area, which is exactly what Patton was counting on. He issued his orders with characteristic directness and without waiting for elaborate approval from higher headquarters. Third Army would cross the Rhine near Oppenheim, with multiple divisions assaulting the river simultaneously to establish bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The crossing would be fast, it would be aggressive, and it would exploit the element of surprise that the Germans had carelessly given away by concentrating on the wrong location. Patton assigned the crossing to multiple corps, with each unit advancing at night when possible to avoid German air observation and artillery fire. The 94th Infantry Division and the 8th Armoured Division would make the initial assault crossings in assault boats, establishing footholds on the eastern bank, while engineers assembled pontoon bridges to allow heavier vehicles and tanks to follow. The 35th Infantry Division and the 17th Armoured Division would cross at different locations, further spreading German attention and resources across a wider frontage. The planning emphasized speed above perfection. Patton wanted assault forces across the river before dawn if possible, before German defenders could fully understand what was happening or concentrate artillery fire on the crossing sites. Pontoon bridges would be assembled as quickly as engineering techniques allowed, but assembly would not be a barrier to the assault. Infantry would cross first in boats, followed by engineers, followed by vehicles that could ford or that could wait for bridges to be completed. The entire operation was designed around one principle: get across fast, establish secure bridgeheads, and then pour reinforcements across as quickly as logistics allowed. The crossing began on the evening of the 23rd of March 1945, with assault boats being paddled across the dark water, while German sentries on the eastern bank remained largely unaware of what was happening. For hours, the crossing proceeded in near silence. American soldiers in assault boats moving through darkness, German defensive positions not yet fully alert, the element of surprise holding firm. When German fire finally erupted, it came in scattered bursts rather than the coordinated, devastating response that might have been possible had the Germans been fully prepared. The American assault units returned fire, consolidated their positions, and waited for the engineers to begin assembling pontoon bridges. By the time dawn broke on the 24th of March, American forces held secure bridgeheads on the eastern bank, with multiple divisions having crossed and German counterattacks already forming but failing to dislodge the American